was called the finale of the Old Testament. What did you call it, Dale?
Finale of
It
the
was
Jesus in the Old Testament, abolished or
okay.
fulfilled.
Okay, yeah, that was it. What he said. We're not going to go back and recapitulate much, but I do have at least one response that I wanted to give to one of Dale's speeches before. We were being very polite and allowing each person to say lots of things, but that means there are lots of things that go unresponded to. So in the comments, if you were thinking, man, why didn't that big idea was dangling out there? And well, it's that just happened. Okay. I recognize that we can't go back and do it all, but we've got more to go. So here we go. So Dale, I just want to kind of pick up on one of the things that you said before. You were saying, well, surely God never meant these things to be forever and unchanging because look, they were carried off into captivity, and or look, they were, they were mostly massacred when Moses got the law, and they were building idols. That was an example you used, but you used a number of examples. And what needed to be said to that was that's very circular reasoning. So I agree that there are lots of places where the covenant is broken, where it couldn't possibly go on. But your starting point is God must not have meant it to be an unbroken chain of permanence because look, this chain is clearly broken several times. And what I am saying is you're proving my point. The chain has been broken several times. Therefore, the covenant was always false. It never happened. And if it's going to happen, we still have to wait on it to happen. But all of those things that you mentioned are things that prove that the covenant never happened. It doesn't prove that God didn't mean forever when he said forever.
Okay. Okay. Is that it for your
That's it.
recapitulation?
I've reduced it to that.
Okay.
That and whatever my dogs have to say.
Okay, cool. Fair point, and I'll respond to this objection when we get to the next specific topics because I have a response for that, and it's going to involve the same thing when we get to the temple or stuff like that, sacrifices and stuff. So yeah, I'll save my response, my retort for this circular reasoning charge when we get there.
Okay.
But just by way of my short introduction, to just a reminder, let me bring up here. So there are general principles. Remember, the goal here is not to prove that the Old Testament contradicts itself. David is specifically trying to prove that the New Testament is inconsistent or contradicts or abolishes the Old Testament promises and that sort of thing and or covenant. And my goal to rebut that is simply to prove that the Protestant Old Testament allows for certain interpretational principles which make this not a contradiction, but a fulfillment. And on that front, there are three general principles that we get from the Old Testament. So the first is that any and all promises in the Torah, as well as covenant or the commandments, are conditional. They're contingent upon whether or not Israel and the Jewish people respond positively or negatively. So all of these promises can be not fulfilled on God's part, but that's not a contradiction of the original Torah promise. So they're contingent. Um, Also, there's with these promises, there's an inherent limitations which all Jews in the Old Testament or in the prophets understood. And again, my goal is if I can prove some Jewish guy in a biblical book understood it this way, that's good enough for fulfilling my claim, my limited claim in this show. And yeah, there are prophets in that who understood the inherent limitations of these commandments and promises. So, for example, 75% of the commands and stuff can only be fulfilled if there's a standing temple, if the Jews are sovereign over their land and not in exile, for example, and stuff like that. So there are certain limitations. That's the second major principle. And the third and final one, just to keep this as short as possible, that I didn't stress last time, but this is going to be really important. It's this concept of pleru, this fulfillment aspect or completion, right? So when we say fulfilled, I saw beloved Darren Lute asking, what does that mean? It means completion. It serves the commandments and the promises of the covenant in the Old Testament serve a function, a purpose within salvation history. Every Jew in the world will admit this. Every Christian, even the atheists, will admit this. Yeah, they're serving a function within God's overall plan for Israel as a nation. And once those functions are completed, there's no longer a need for that. And that's why the New Testament is not contradicting um, these aspects and that sort of thing. So this issue of completion and what is the function of the promises and the commands in given circumstances versus other circumstances is a key principle that's established in the Old Testament itself. Um, and that'll keep these three principles in mind as I give my answers to David's specific examples. And with that, I'll leave it at that for my opening.
Okay, I just have to relitigate a little bit. So, yeah, you
Relitigate an
said
opening?
all scholars and atheists and Christians would agree that that uh, Jesus was talking about completion, and that Jews meant that these functions would be no longer necessary. I strongly disagree with that. That's an interpretation that has not yet been entered into evidence, and I don't think it can be. So I make the diametrically opposed claim that, in fact, that is false.
Do
Um,
you have a
I understand that
PhD?
that's how Christians think of it, but that's how
Well,
Christians have to think of it. It's not how Jews thought of it, and it's not how Jesus thought of it.
no, it is the Jews. So this is coming from biblical scholars. So I would just say, great. That's not how you see it. But last time I checked, you don't have a PhD in biblical scholarship. So I'll accept any atheist, any Jewish or Christian scholar. They all understand, even from an Old Testament perspective, that now they have a different of interpretation as to what it means for it to be complete. Right? Jews today don't believe the Old Testament has been completed yet, but they would agree that, yeah, these things serve a function and will be completed when the Messiah comes at some point in the future and stuff. So it's a principle of the Old Testament that the covenant is always intended to be temporary and will be completed.
That is what I am disputing, and I think I can prove it strictly within the Old Testament. I don't need a PhD for that.
Okay. Well, I think I
So
trust
that
biblical.
this will be litigated in further points, but I wanted to challenge that notion because yeah, I know it's a thing that you want to state as an unquestionable fact, but it will be questioned and challenged, and that is a part of my uh, point that I am making, and it's part of my entire argument. And when Jesus said, "Not abolish but fulfill," I argue that Christians are using a uh, version of the idea of fulfilled that is not compatible with the text. That said, why don't we start moving to the next points that need to be made?
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, your it's your claim, so I guess you get to go first on the next thing. Um, do you want to cover them separately? Like I know you had the temple. Um,
Yes.
that I don't, yeah. Do you want to cover them separately, or do you think you could combine it with sacrifices? Whatever you want to do.
No. Well, some things might. I'll try to do as much as I can at once, but I don't want to smear this so much that it all it all blends together too much. That's not what I'm doing. So there are separate things to be made in these points. I'm just vamping a little bit because I am looking for my document. Okay, I got it back. So we did Abraham's seed, land. We didn't really talk about. Did we get into the temple at all?
No, no. So we had one last point to discuss on point number two about the
Okay.
land. Yeah,
Okay.
but we
Remind
never
me,
touched it.
bring us back to where we were, because you've got a better memory of that than me.
Well, so I think yeah, we should go on with the temple, but there was this moral point dealing with what I think deals with free will, right? Because where we
Oh
got
yeah.
cut off, you were arguing that look, this content even if I admit the promises are contingent, it's really just a farce because God knows in advance they're going to keep on sinning and they're going to fail to meet this contingent. So it's not
Yes.
really it's an immoral deal. That and then yeah, I got cut off before I
This is not a major point for the argument. It's an observation that that I do think, if we were doing an after show or something like that, I would probably bounce on this a little bit more. But yeah, I think the entire idea of a covenant with an all-knowing, all-powerful God is ridiculous. It's by its very nature a sham. It has to be a sham. It can't be anything else. And it's not about whether God made people do this thing or that. In all possible universes where people could have made any choices, maybe there are multiple universes, any possible world where, Eve doesn't eat the fruit. God could have chosen that possible world and made that one actualize. He made the one actualize that he wanted. And the world that he wanted included the people choosing not to keep the covenant. And so that was there before he even made the covenant. So he has to have a point for a covenant being broken before all of this drama begins. Otherwise, it's just a sham. It's Lucy pulling the football. Oh, you missed again. Um, so I don't, once again, I don't want to over index on that. I know that that leads into an argument about Molinism for you. And so I will take a brief nap while you defend that. But I would just argue that's irrelevant, though, because it's not a matter of whether God made them do this. Is not a free will argument. This is a middle knowledge argument. It is, I'm accepting the Molinism and saying that it's a sham because God knew.
Okay, so twofold response. So you claim that it's a sham. That's just meaningless to me. Then I have to understand what you mean by sham because in any meaningful way, a Christian is going to take this in order for the covenant, the contingent covenant, to be a sham. You have to prove that they were determined to make the choices to sin and therefore fall short of these blessings of the land in this case that we're talking about or the temple or whatever it is. You can't I don't think you can prove that. And again, David says it's outside the scope of this, but I'll just say this. If Molinism is true, if they had libertarian free will, then they had the ability to do otherwise. They had the ability to choose not to sin, and therefore it's not a sham in any meaningful sense. Maybe David has some ad hoc definition of sham, whereby even if they had the ability to do otherwise, it's still a sham. I don't know. I would need to understand more about what he means by that. But here's my response. It's a shocker.
Can I give you a quick example?
Um,
I can do it in 30
okay.
seconds.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So Super Bowl just happened. Congratulations, Seattle Seahawks. Um, I know who won. I know what the score was. If I had the ability to go back in time and I talked to the New England Patriots and I said, if you win this game, if you make the plays that you should make, then I will give each one of you $1 billion. It's a sham. I'm a time traveler. I know they're going to lose. That's what I mean.
Okay. I just disagree. That's not a sham. They had the opportunity to meet that condition, and they still failed it of their own accord. Nothing about your knowledge brought about their failure for that result. But
No,
here,
but the,
here's
the covenant came after the failure. I mean, I'm sorry. Yeah, the covenant came after the failure because God already knew about the failure, and then He gave them the covenant.
well, it didn't come after the failure. It came after his knowledge, logically after his knowledge of the failure. Yes,
So that's
but,
what I mean.
but
That's my
knowledge.
definition. I won't go any further than that. I will leave you uninterrupted. But you seemed like you didn't know what I meant, and I just wanted to clarify, give you an example of what I meant.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so this is a free will debate. Does foreknowledge play any causal? Is it in the causal chain? Or sorry, is it within the causal chain, whereby it plays a fully determining thing on the Jewish people choosing to sin or something? And if you go for Molinism, the answer is no, and therefore it's not a sham. But here's my second answer, the shocking answer that I wanted to give you is let's pretend David's right. Forget about the free will debate. It is a sham. Let's say for the sake of argument, it is a sham. Who cares? For the purposes of this debate, we're not debating the morality of the covenants or whether it's fair or not. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's the covenant that God made as an immoral bastard, according to David, is still, yeah, you will keep the land if you sin. Sorry, if you choose to obey me, you'll keep the land forever and stuff like that at all times. If you choose to sin, you will lose the land. And it doesn't matter whether God is the one zapping them and making them sin or not. We're not debating the morality of the covenant. We're just saying, well, this is the fact of the covenant that the Old Testament God gave them. And it has this inherent contingency in it, which is consistent with the New Testament, which accepts contingency of the land promise.
Oh, I already agreed that it is a tangential point. So,
Okay. But yeah,
um,
I made it clear for the audience in an entertaining way. So
okay. Um, yeah.
So you concede that the land is not a good disproof of the New Testament, just to
Oh
clarify.
no, I do see it as a disproof of the New Testament, but I do need to ask you a clarifying question.
Sure.
So I wrote, I don't even know if I wrote it, but I did talk about it a little bit on the board. Excuse me. I think that Brian and I had a brief conversation about it. So do, the one of the ways this can be interpreted, yeah, I did write a little bit, um, is that there is one covenant, and it was a kind of an on again, off again thing, but it was a single covenant the whole time. And another way of looking at it is that it was multiple covenants. So God made a covenant, they broke it, and He says, okay, you're done. I'm going to make another one. They did it again, broke it. Okay, I'm going to make you another one. So, how you view that probably determines, the kinds of conclusions that we come to. So, I'm coming from the perspective of it was a single covenant that God just kept re-upping. But every time He re-upped it, it was still the same covenant. And so that means the original covenant has not come to pass. And the fact that they sinned doesn't really matter. Um, if you're saying it's different covenants, then that first covenant is over. God's going to make a brand new covenant, and we can see whether that panned out or not, or if it goes away every time they sin. It's just a new covenant because God kept coming back to them. They didn't keep coming back to God. So I don't know exactly what God is doing here, except he has some plan that requires this covenant. Um, so just that question probably made it more confusing than it needs to be. But is it a single covenant that God kept renewing, or is the first covenant with Abraham broken and he makes another covenant with Isaac? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so okay, so I think I would tend towards so keeping it this way. Let's say that the old covenant starting with Moses to keep things simple for now. I
Okay.
definitely take your view whereby it's one covenant kind of thing that even though Israel broke the covenant, the covenant punishments and cursings were a part of that, and they were applied to them, and then he restored them after they went through their time of punishment. Then he restored them physically, and that also deals with Daniel 9 restoring them spiritually afterwards as well, which took up to the time of Jesus and the 70 weeks prophecy. So that, yeah, I think pre and post exile is definitely one covenant. Is the covenant that God made with Abraham the same? Um, Again, I would yeah, like obviously I would say they're all the Old Testament, like maybe in the sense of like pre-covenants with amendments that get added at the time of Moses, right? Like so I don't think that the covenant he made with Abraham let's call it the pre Old Testament covenant kind of thing because I think it was fulfilled. I don't think the covenant with Abraham was broken. He had all of his seed and they became kings in many nations and stuff like that. So the
Didn't
promises.
possess Canaan.
I'm sorry.
They didn't possess Canaan.
Right. And but they will in the future in terms. Oh, we mean
That was part of the promises. So you're saying it was all fulfilled. I'm just saying it wasn't all fulfilled.
well, it doesn't say Abraham would possess Canaan. You admitted that last week. Right? Like the promises aren't instantly fulfilled. And you said, remember, we even looked and it said, yeah, it's to his descendants, and his descendants occupy
For you
Canaan.
and your descendants, yes, I agree with that. But that means that it still needed to be fulfilled at some point, and it never was.
What do you mean it?
So
uh,
you can't say it was fulfilled. It was all fulfilled from Abraham. That's still a hangover throughout the ages. And so you can say 99% of it was fulfilled, but you can't say 100% of it was.
why is it a hangover? Like Israel did occupy Canaan just as promised.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, they did. The land of Canaan, they conquered it.
No, they didn't.
Which part did they not conquer?
I've spilled a lot of ink on this.
Remember, I've
They
got 10
never
pages.
possessed all of Canaan. The land they never possessed at all.
Right. There were certain lands that were promised that we agree haven't been conquered as part of Israel's boundaries. But which parts of Canaan did it never conquer? I think they
Well,
talked about.
when I say Canaan, this is why I read the text last time when he promised it. There are specific areas, and not all of the areas were elucidated there, but there were a couple of places in the Bible, at least a couple, where it spells out in more detail what land it was supposed to be. So if you want to separate Abraham and say all of his promises were covered, you have to show where they possessed all of that land because God promised that. And if you say, well, that land hasn't been conquered yet, then it hasn't been fulfilled yet. So you can't set Abraham off to the side and start with Moses.
Yeah, well, that's why I said he's got the pre-covenant. It's the same covenant with just, and then over time it gains amendments to it, specifying in more and more detail where we get
Is
the
it
laws.
possible to make amendments to covenants?
Of
Because
course.
Paul says that once the will is made, you can't go changing it.
Oh, of course.
So
Yeah, it's progressive revelation and progressive a progressive covenant. It started with Abraham in very basic details. There's no contradiction with what Moses did compared to Abraham and stuff like that. So it's just continuing
so
on, right? He gives this
I,
general promise to Abraham, the pre-covenant and
I,
stuff, and then
it's
Moses comes
it's
on.
not a pre-covenant. I guess I'm taking issue with that. It's the covenant.
Sure,
At
sure.
no point is all of the covenant stated together. So if we agree on that, it's not a pre-covenant, it's a covenant.
Okay, yeah.
Um,
As long as you're not going to be like, well, okay, if it's a covenant, it has to be it can't be amended, I guess, right? So yeah, fine. If you want to say Abraham had the Mosaic covenant in proto form, cool, yeah. And then Moses came and completed the rest of it, kind of thing, and gave us all the commandments that Abraham didn't have to live by and all that stuff, right?
well, yes, but that so I'm not disagreeing with you as hard as you think I am, but there is a point here where I hope that a few nerds can nerd out later because I brought this up. Um, so Abraham gets some part of a promise. And I will go ahead and use the word covenant
Okay.
here, although I'm not entirely sure how well that applies to the Abrahamic part of this. But that said, Abraham gets a promise slash covenant, but it
Sorry, can I,
wasn't everything. And so if it's just one covenant, then you would be on the side of a progressive revelation covenant, as you mentioned, and God just tells Abraham a little bit of it.
yeah,
Abraham doesn't know spit about what's ultimately going to happen with this covenant then. He just knows a little bitty piece of it. And then Moses learns a little bitty more piece of it. And then the prophets get some more pieces of it. It's constantly being revealed. And I think there's an argument to be made that uh, instead of saying this is all of one piece, one progressive piece, that this is different people at different times having different views of what the relationship with God is. I don't think they were univocal. The only reason you would say it's one thing and progressive revelation is if you were defending the idea of univocality. I do not.
yeah. I mean, yeah, obviously, as a Bible believing Christian, I believe that the Holy Spirit inspired all of Scripture. They are literally God's words breathed, and as expressed molinistically by the human authors and stuff like that. So, yeah, I believe in univocality, in the providential sense, kind of thing.
Right, but that's a presupposition. That's not necessarily uh, representative of the text. So my argument is not about the theology as much as it's about the literature. And if you're trying to derive a theology, it's a theology based on exactly the literature as opposed to some presupposition. I understand how you get to where you are because you're forcing univocality on texts that are fundamentally not univocal. But I'm not, which should allow you to see how I get where I am. Because when I look at the literature, I don't see one voice going through all of this. I see lots of people over time uh, coming up with different ideas of their relationship with God, and this is why you say, well, it has to be a fundamentally different relationship post diaspora because it
Well,
just has
let,
to be. And what you're saying is that God intended it to be that way. And I'm saying, no, he didn't. The reason it's different is because their lives were turned upside down and it all went to hell. And they have to try to make sense of that. And so they relitigate the old stories about the old covenants and old promises, and they have to try to make it fit the new circumstance.
Okay. So in order so I get, yeah, what you're saying. My thing is, as just stated it as an assertion so far. For the purposes of this debate, I think I can prove it. Obviously, I'm not arguing, I don't care about convincing you as an atheist, but to win this debate, I think I could say that I can, number one, I would argue that definitely Jesus sees this continuation and then he brings in the completion, right? So he doesn't see he sees the univocality of the inspiration of the law and the prophets. Now, to win this debate, what about the Jewish Old Testament writers? And I think they would also see the providential. You, as an atheist, might say they saw it wrongly, but again, I'm just trying to argue that the New Testament view of the univocality of the inspiration of Scripture is consistent with the Old Testament Jewish scriptural view. They also viewed, yeah, that these are the words of God. This like inspiration and of the words of the Old Testament is what the ancient Jewish people believed. So I don't see how you can prove any kind of contradiction then, which is the goal of the show, between the New Testament view of the univocality of the Old Covenant compared to what the Old Testament writers themselves had.
I think once you recognize that there is not univocality in the Old Testament, then you realize it's impossible for there to be univocality in the New Testament about the Old Testament because there were different views in the Old Testament. And so, whatever New Testament writer is writing on whatever promise they're talking about, they have to try to harmonize the disparate ideas within the Old Testament and say, okay, this is ultimately what all of that meant. Or they just have to pick a side and say this is what this ultimately meant. But there is no one Old Testament view on which to build. So this is, I think I may have briefly mentioned this last week. I forget what we say on the show. It was supposed to what we say out of the show, but I think that Paul is guilty of terrible hermeneutics. And one of the reasons he's guilty of terrible hermeneutics, it would fail a first year class today, even from, I think, a conservative school, is because he's trying to force a kind of a univocality on the various pieces of the Old Testament to substantiate the new thing that he wants to do. And so he has to read into scripture in some very obvious and coarse ways to get what he wants out of it.
Okay. So I'm trying now, again, don't forget with the New Testament, when we come to Paul and Jesus and stuff like that, they are claiming to have a new covenant because the old one has been completed. So that is a relevant difference compared
Uh,
to how the prophets of the Old Testament, how they would have seen the prophets treating
I
the law
actually don't think
in the
that Paul
same
and
way.
Jesus were on the same page at all.
Okay.
So this is one of these areas, one of these rare times when I'm going to promote Jesus uh, over Paul, because between the two characters, Jesus was better.
Okay. So
um, and
okay.
I think it was truer to the spirit of the Old Testament than Paul. I think Paul went way off the reservation.
Okay. So let's forget about the New Testament just for a second.
Okay.
Looking just at the Old Testament, would you agree that would you agree that the Jewish writers of Scripture, regardless of whether they're factually right or wrong, they thought that yeah, the Scriptures had this univocality and that they were a part of the same covenant, like the prophet Jeremiah or the prophet Daniel thought they were part of the same old covenant as Moses that Moses gave, or that that they were successors of Abraham, children of Abraham. They were taking part of the benefits of that same covenant that God gave to them.
That
Um,
is that is a hard question. I'm going to lean toward um, them not being on the same page
okay.
because they had to. Um, I think this was a constant conversation and debate through all of the Old Testament time. So, for instance, I don't think the prophets were ever on the same page as the priests um, to begin with. So, I don't think there was, this one thing that, then this other group branched off. There were as early as we can go, different voices in this. So, I think the prophets uh, were keen to lean on the whatever God promised. It doesn't matter. You've all sinned. You've gone away, and God has spewed you out of His mouth. And but later, God's going to offer. God's going to reclaim you, and then we're going to do it this way going forward. So I do think they saw maybe something like a continuation, but it was going to be a different continuation because they never were on board with the original thing anyway. So
And that,
it's both sides are kind of having a debate throughout the entire whole Old Testament. So it's really hard to say the Old Testament says this or the Old Testament says that. And that's part of the challenge I've given myself because I'm taking it in aggregate. So I don't want to, I'm going to allow whatever points you want to score on saying all of this is irrelevant. But as you can see, as the further we go,
mhm.
it's probably more relevant than I've made it out to be. I'm just trying to argue without making that point too much.
Okay. Okay. I'll just end with this then that I obviously I think that Jeremiah and the prophets they don't contradict and for example on sacrifices we'll come to that when we get to that topic but for now I disagree with David that they contradicted any of the earlier covenant or the Torah and stuff but even taking that aside, David has conceded that in some sense, and I think this is clear just from reading the biblical text, it's clear Jeremiah and Isaiah, the prophets that say, bad things about sacrifices and stuff like that, that they still see themselves as following the law of Moses. I mean, Jeremiah's whole point, he's lamenting that, oh my God, oh my gosh, sorry, the King David's dynasty is going to end. Babylon's coming. They're going to destroy the city of Jerusalem and were being punished under the law and stuff. So there's this continuity. He still sees I'm under the same old covenant that Moses was, that the judges were, that the King David and King Solomon were. Um, so there is this continuity, even if there are, let's call them alterations for the sake of argument or something. Again, I mean, David will debate whether that's actually a contradiction on their part or not, but for our purposes in this debate, even if there are different emphases and stuff like that on certain issues, there's still this continuity. They're still a part of this one covenant of God, where God is giving them this providentially univocal purpose in salvation history and scriptural revelation. And I'm gonna argue that that same understanding led up to Jesus' day. The Jewish people, this is why they say, hey, it's important. I'm a son of Abraham. That promise applies to me in virtue of my genes. Remember, as David was arguing, that was their understanding. That it was false, according to Jesus, that their genes wasn't what was important. But even as late as Jesus' time, these Jews are still thinking they're beneficiaries. They're in continuity with the covenant to Abraham, the covenant to Moses and stuff. It's not, oh shoot, yeah, the law of Moses, the covenant of Moses, that was gone in 500 BC. Now we're under the covenant of Phineas or something like that, or the covenant of Ezra. They didn't see it that way. So that's my only point, and that's consistent with how the New Testament saw the old covenant functioning under the Jewish people up until the time of Jesus, where, okay, now there is something different. Now there is a new covenant coming in because the old one has been fulfilled, kind of thing. But they would admit, yeah, that Jeremiah lived under the same covenant as Moses, and Moses was under the same covenant as Abraham and stuff like that. These were all a part of the same covenant of salvation, let's say, or redemption. I would also include the covenant of Noah before Abraham. That was also a predecessor, uh, part of the same covenant, but just in an even more general form, kind of thing. So yeah, that's all I'll say
Yeah.
on that
Yeah,
thing.
so we keep, yeah, I mean, they keep adding things to the covenant. The covenant and the promises kind of get mixed up together in one muddy mess. One could argue that the promises are different from the covenants. I don't buy that, but that could be one way to do it. For instance, talk about King David's dynasty. It becomes really important in this whole covenant thing. Well, there was no David uh, uh, through Abraham and Moses and such. David doesn't come until much later. Um, but that gets rolled into this whole rolling, growing covenant like a snowball going downhill. Um, so let's jump over to the temple. I'll abbreviate um, most of my remarks here. Um, so there's a passage of scripture that I'm not going to read, but you can read Exodus 26 and learn about the temple. In fact, this was the tabernacle, but it's what became the temple. And so, if you'll allow me the um, indulgence of conflating the tabernacle and the temple, because I think it's kind of one continuous thing, if you will. Um, I will do that if you want to debate it. I will leave it unrebutted for now, because you can take all of the comments that I'm making and shift it to the temple if you think that the tabernacle and the temple aren't, in fact, of the same
Yeah.
piece. But the thing to note is that it was very physical. It's a very physical thing. And it was more than physical, it was heavily specifically regulated with materials and the placement of things. God was very particular about where that staff should be. Uh, don't move it 3 inches to the left. You might get, burned down. Very particular about the decorations on the Ark of the Covenant. Super specific. So um, these are not spiritual, mystical things. This was a freaking tent and or giant building on a piece of property. That's what we're talking about. The temple was not spiritual; it was physical. God dwelled there to some real extent in the Holy of Holies. There were physical parts of the temple that people could not go, except for the high priest once a year, that sort of thing. So what I'm saying in all of this is that this was understood as a physical thing, and the promises associated with it depend on a physical temple that is up to the specifications that God gave. And so, what happens fairly quickly in the New Testament, we see that the temple is a problem because it ain't there no more. Um, so they got to do something else. The moment, and Dell is correct about this. The moment the temple goes down, there's no covenant. There's no way to do it. Uh, because so much of it is tied to the specific land, not some spiritual idea, not some place that's going to come thudding down from heaven, actual land, in an actual building with actual implements with specific people doing it. When you don't have that anymore, when you don't have any one of those pieces, you don't have the covenant. You have a mess. And the only thing people can do is kind of invent compromises. I used to, when I was a kid, wonder where did the synagogues come from? There are no synagogues, no synagogues. All of a sudden, there's synagogues. Um, we could talk about that, but it's associated with this. And so, what happens in Second Corinthians? Uh, Paul is talking about the temple. Now, the temple may actually still be there. If Paul is writing early, he probably is one of the earliest writers, him and James. So maybe the temple is still there, but it's not really something that they control so much. So even then, the temple was very compromised. Uh, and it wouldn't be long before it was destroyed. And so Paul is already talking about the temple as if it's not, the building is not that important, that God doesn't dwell in houses made with hands, which is a direct contradiction from all those Old Testament passages where the temple is, in fact, God's house and dwelling place, at least to some degree. But that's problematic because, again, once somebody tears up the temple, God's got to move. And then you have to say, well, surely God never lived there, because if he did, no one would have been able to destroy the temple. So was God defeated? So I think it's very natural for people in Paul's time to start thinking about the temple as a more spiritualized thing. Your body is the temple of God. Your body is the tabernacle. Paul uses those words, so you can talk temple or tabernacle. It's fine with me. So God goes through. So Paul goes through all of that, and I think that again, this is just a part of that progression of this was the Old Testament promises. What I didn't mention here is there's a lot of forever stuff spoken around the temple. We might come to that later. But clearly, the temple wasn't something that was forever. Clearly, the covenant wasn't fulfilled because the temple would have lasted forever, and it didn't. So destroyed, we rebuild it, we destroy it again. In order to claim fulfillment, you need a physical temple that lasts forever. It's never happened. It's never going to happen. So I'll cut it off there.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So a couple of radical points there. But okay, so Forever Temple. Sorry, just finishing up my notes. Okay, so by way of response, so David wants to say that the old covenant has to be physical, and look, the promises and the covenant specifies even like such minute details, like the hooks of gold and stuff like that. So right away, David has to acknowledge that he quotes Exodus 26 for the specifics of how the temple had to be set up and stuff like that. Or sorry, no, where's your quote? Okay, well, there are
Yeah,
specifics for how the temple. Do you know which verse you quoted there for the temple?
uh, I quoted Exodus 26, but that was a,
Tabernacle.
a tabernacle, and it was the tabernacle. You can call it the proto temple, if you
Mhm.
like. But
Right.
it's very easy to find even greater, more lavish descriptions of the actual temple when it was to be built. And so I've conflated those two together because the New Testament writers also conflate them together.
Okay, okay. So here's the first stepping stone that proves David's wrong here about the essentiality. And by the essentiality, I'm talking about the temporal essentiality, meaning for it has to be forever, all times. Obviously, there were times when the temple didn't exist and couldn't have the specific thingamajigs in this spot or the golden pomegranate here. No, there was no temple, and the physical location doesn't matter either because there was the tabernacle, and David saying that was good enough. The tabernacle moved around, and the main point of the temple and the tabernacle is about why is it special? Because it has the divine Shekinah, the divine presence and glory of God in this spatial location. This is a special location, physical location on earth, where God's presence is said to be present in a special, glorious way. So that's why the temple was so important. If that got destroyed, the Jews were crying all night for for centuries over something like that. And it's the same. It comes from that the literal word Shekinah means to pitch his tent because it's grounded in this tabernacle, which was a movable tent that the Jewish people, before they settled in Jerusalem and that built the temple under Solomon, this was the special place wherever that tabernacle was, where God's Shekinah would be. But is the tabernacle necessary? Well, not necessarily, right? Because we remember God's presence being in divine Shekinah being in the fire above, when Moses was taking them and in the cloud during the day and stuff in the fire at night, so that the Shekinah wasn't bound to any physical objects on earth. God's
That
special.
said, he did like tents because he was in the tent of meetings too. So
I'm
just
sorry.
putting that out there. I said God liked tents because he was in the tent of meetings with Moses.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. But the point is, his special Shekinah is not tied down to one specific physical location or one set of physical
It
environment.
wasn't then. It wasn't then, and that's why I called it the proto temple because the
Okay.
temple became the permanence that the tabernacle couldn't have. In fact, when
So you
David
you
was
believe in a
suggesting the
modified
temple,
covenant too, right? Progressive covenants as well, then.
no, it's not a progressive covenants; it's failure. But that's sad. Here, let me. I'm trying to clear my space for that call that was not supposed to come through. No, it's so at the time of the tabernacle, there was no temple or thought of a temple, and God thought it was good enough. And David said, "This isn't good enough. You need a castle, essentially." And God was like, "Yep, okay, sounds good. You're not going to do it, but I'll let you lay out the plans." And then when we got the castle, then we got new promises associated with that. And so the temple was a proto, I mean, the tabernacle was a proto temple, but the temple was the thing where we got new promises around, and those promises were forever. This was a forever temple. The tabernacle, yes, that was a temporary movable thing, but it led to the temple, which was not. And the temple became the source of promises and covenant, which we will soon get to.
Okay. So the only issue for the New Testament are these promises that came into effect as of when the temple building was constructed. Is that's
Yes.
your argument? Okay. Okay,
Yes.
cool. So in that case, I'll take the focus away from that. But we understand the import. Why is the temple important? Is because of this Shekinah, the divine glory, glorious presence of God here on earth in this place in the temple.
Completely
And
agree. Yep.
and there is this principle, like obviously God is not literally limited to that outside of his choice, because we had the tabernacle before that where he wasn't. But so what would I say in terms of the promises that came into effect when the temple was in? Do those contradict anything in the New Testament? Once again, no. Strictly from an Old Testament perspective, we know that God's Shekinah and divine glory is not bound to any physical location on earth unless he chooses to make his presence special in that location. And the prophets tell us this. They directly say, do you honestly think God is limited to some scrubby little building in the middle of Jerusalem? No, he's chosen to dwell there in a special way for our benefit. But in real life, he's omnipresent. He fills up the whole heavens and stuff like that. So this is Old Testament Jewish understanding, just like the Christians, that it's a spiritualized, non-limited omnipresence of God's true divine glory and stuff like that. But he yet at the same time has this Shekinah in the temple location while it stands. Once again, the temple was destroyed. The first temple of Solomon was destroyed and it was rebuilt. And every Jew in the world says, yeah, that's not a problem. All the Old Testament prophets post the exile, none of them were like, oh, this is horrible. The covenant of Moses is over. But guess what? It's okay. We now have the covenant of Ezra. God came down and said, "Sorry, I screwed up. I messed up. I failed to fulfill the terms of the contract. But here's a new contract for you, and this will last for the time of Jesus or something." No, the Jews saw the Mosaic covenant still going on, and despite this destruction of the temple. So now there is an interesting thing here. When the second temple was rebuilt, something was missing from the second temple: the Shekinah, the divine presence and glory of God. The Jews admit this house, there's stuff missing. God's presence is not dwelling here. He's not pitching his tent in this location like he did with the temple of King Solomon. And yet we have a prophecy, a messianic prophecy, saying that the glory of the second temple, the Shekinah of the second temple, will be even greater. So I just find it interesting that Christianity has the only answer for that, because God on earth, incarnate Jesus Christ, entered the temple on a mission of redemption, bringing about the fulfillment of the old covenant. Now, that's a greater glory than God just dwelling at the first temple. This is bringing about dwelling at his temple and bringing about the completion of his mission for redemption of his people and stuff like that. So, if anything, the New Testament is perfectly consistent. And I would argue it's impossible for the Old Testament covenant. I would agree. Under Judaism, the Old Covenant is a farce, because that second temple was built and destroyed in 70 AD. And without Jesus, God incarnate, the Christian understanding of entering that temple, the glory was never as great. The Shekinah never returned to the second temple, let alone was even more glorious than what was in King Solomon's temple. So
The
thank
problem is that that Shekinah was supposed to be there forever. And so I know that you say God is not limited to a building. He's limited to whatever he limits himself to. Uh, so Jesus wasn't limited, God wasn't limited to a body before he poured himself into one. So if he makes a promise that I will be in your presence forever in this temple that will not fall, kind of thing, then that's what has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then you have to do what the New Testament writers did, was to try to find a way to make it rhetorically happen. Uh, some spiritualized version of it happening, but I would contend that all of those spiritualized explanations are an admission that the other thing didn't happen.
Well, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, because you mentioned Paul and stuff. It was natural for no, it was the opposite. Every scholar in the world, Bart Ehrman, would laugh at you for saying that. The natural thing was the physical interpretation. At the time of Paul, the Second Temple still standing, even after the Second Temple was destroyed. It wasn't until 135 AD, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, that Jews finally started going, no, okay, we got to spiritualize things. Let's stop being so literal and political, because we keep flopping at that, right? But before that, in the time of Paul, it's the opposite. Spiritualizing was, holy cow, you got to be inspired by God to think of that, because everyone thinks of the physical thing literally. The temple, the Messiah is going to show up and he's going to destroy all the Romans. That was the common view at the time of the Apostle Paul. So,
That was definitely the view of some of the sects of Jews.
including the
But we can't
Pharisees,
we
Paul.
can't pretend that all of the Jews were univocal in the New Testament any more than they were in the Old Testament,
Okay,
because they
well,
weren't.
Paul was a student of Gamaliel, a
Yeah, it
Pharisee,
says that.
and
Um,
Pharisees viewed the
he, he claims that he was a Pharisee and student of Gamaliel. I'm not going to get to that. I think Paul
you,
was a fabulist, which is a fancy way of saying he's a liar. But
you don't believe he was a
that is
Pharisee?
not the scope of this.
Okay, okay, fair enough. Well,
So
okay, so here, let me respond to the main point about this. My point, so spiritualization, clearly the physical things are only relevant by choice. But even according to the Old Testament, the second temple building by choice was not special for God's glory. His divine Shekinah did not return to that building.
right, which means
Promise.
that it can't possibly have had anything to do with the promise, unless the people of that time reinterpreted again, the promise to mean whatever their situation was then. Uh, but there's no way that you can match up the promises of the temple and say the second temple fulfilled it
No, but you
because it
can
didn't.
because yeah, like I said, Jesus came to complete the mission, right? He was God in the flesh, the divine presence. He entered the temple, and on those grounds, he completed the mission of redemption through his sacrificial death and stuff. I know we're not on sacrifices, but he completed
No,
the
we're
purpose
getting there.
of the temple, and now we're in a new covenant, which is what
Yeah, it
the
wasn't the
Christians
purpose of the
teach.
temple, though, for them. That's not what the temple was to them. Why don't we move to the next point, though?
But okay, but I haven't finished. You got to let me finish my point. Okay,
All right, you finish your point, and we'll move on to the next point because they're connected.
okay. So my point is with the spiritualization, the body, our bodies becoming the temple of Christ. This aspect makes sense because the physical body, again, the principle behind the temple, tabernacle, or physical bodies of the body of Christ on earth, it doesn't matter where God dwells. That's a choice on his thing. What matters is him dwelling, his Shekinah being present. And today, under the new covenant, right? Once the temple, the physical building, served its purpose, which the Christian story has an account for, Judaism doesn't, as David admitted. At least we have an account for it, whereby it's consistent. Okay, now that purpose of the temple's been completed, and it stands forever. That's olam kind of thing. Again, it just means for a long period of time, kind of thing until completion. There are different meanings for that word, olam in the Hebrew. But once it was completed, the purpose of the temple, now, okay, now the body of Christ is the true temple, Lord, where the Holy Spirit is dwelling. God, the Holy Spirit, his divine Shekinah dwells within us, our our bodies as the temple of God, the body of Christ. Um, and that's perfectly consistent, right? With a fulfillment view kind of thing. There is no contradiction there. The temple stood as long as it needed to. It fulfilled all the prophecies and what it needed to do up until the time of Jesus. And now under a new covenant, now we have a new dwelling place for God to pitch his tent. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say there.
Yeah, it depends on your very specific and bespoke definition of fulfill. So I can take any prophecy, whether it's the Bible or Nostradamus or some Islam prophecy, Hindu. I can take any prophecy and declare it fulfilled and show how my spiritualized fulfillment is what that prophecy was all about. As long as you can do that, then I would concede all prophecies are fulfilled, not just Christian prophecies, every prophecy. But if you take the promise, because I don't even like the word prophecy, if you take the promises, uh, I'm going to do this for you, and that people understood it a certain way. I think it was intended to mean a certain thing in a certain way. We can look at those promises and say they didn't happen, except when you get a religio-theological gloss on it, uh, and look at it under that microscope and say, well, yeah, even though there's no temple, it's been fulfilled. Now, the other strategy is to try to do a both and thing. Um, I don't want to get too far off on this because this is just responding to a point that's not
I know how to
terribly true,
respond. Yeah.
but it's this strategy of saying, uh, well, but if you look at that spiritually, then it was fulfilled, but later it will be physically fulfilled the way they understood it. So it becomes a both and situation, and it's a way for the Christian to try to cover all of their bases, so they can say it has been fulfilled and still acknowledge that it hasn't been fulfilled, but it will be fulfilled. And I would say pick a lane. Um, if it was fulfilled, we can stop thinking about it, but it's still going. So when I talk about Jesus, Jesus was trying to fulfill things that weren't fulfilled. So you can't go back before Jesus and say it was fulfilled. So if Jesus was trying to fulfill something, then the thing he was trying to fulfill wasn't fulfilled. So Jesus fulfills it spiritually, but then we come along with modern debates and say, well, it's still going to be fulfilled the way they understood it. But so is it fulfilled? Is it not fulfilled? Is it spiritual? Is it physical? Pick a lane. And that's why one of the reasons why it's difficult to discuss this particular topic, because when you're talking to people who are, mystics essentially, which is what the spiritualization of this stuff is, anything can mean anything. So the way I'm talking about it is, I think, the way the original Jews would have understood it. The way Dale is talking about it is the way Christians have to understand it, which is to ultra spiritualize things so that all of it's fulfilled instead of failed. The
What
difference between failure and failure is whether you take it literally or not.
Well, I just want to clarify, based on what I've said. Now there are some possible nuances as to what you might be implying here, but in terms of what I presented in this show, I taught the new covenant contains a spiritualized aspect, right? A spiritualized interpretation of what the temple is now under the new covenant. But I didn't in any way spiritualize the fulfillment of the physical temple's purpose. That was purely physical. Jesus was a physical God in the flesh. He entered the temple complex, and this is what the Christians say is the fulfillment of it. And he died for people's sins, a physical death on the cross and stuff like that. So the physical temple, fulfilled its purpose in a physical way, right? It fulfilled its
Let's let's
function.
talk about that. Let's talk about that. So I wanted to get to the Levitical priesthood part of this. So number 4, Levitical priesthood. Not to shortcut the temple, these next few things are of one piece. And so they kind of go together. So I'm just going to read a short version of this. I think I read out longer versions on the original show, but I think this will do for this conversation. Exodus 40, 12 through 15. Then have Aaron and his sons approach the entrance. This is kind of picking up in the middle of a story. Dale, are you familiar with what's going on here?
Uh,
I, I think you should be
so
roughly.
I was reading, so I didn't hear what you said. So
That's fine. So I'm just going to read it out. Then have Aaron and his sons approach the entrance to the meeting tent and wash them with water. Put the holy vestments on Aaron and anoint him and consecrate him so that he might serve as a priest. Also have his sons approach and put their tunics on them, anoint them like their father, so that they might exercise my priesthood in this way. Their anointing will confer upon them an eternal priesthood for all their generations. So we get some eternality here. And this is the beginning. I think this is the first mention of the priesthood. So again, we get a new part of the covenant here that wasn't mentioned before, because this just happened. So we've expanded the covenant again to include a priesthood. Abraham never heard of a priesthood. Okay, knew nothing about that. At some point, you keep tacking on to stuff, and you wonder, can it really be the same covenant? But set that aside. That's as much philosophy as anything else. But we have an eternal priesthood. Can we get an amen? Well, Jeremiah gives an amen. 33, 17 and 18. For thus says the Lord, never will David lack a male descendant to succeed to the throne of the house of Israel. Um, has that happened? No, it didn't. In fact, the last um, king of Israel, I can't remember who it was now. I think it started with a Z, um, somewhere back in the Old Testament, but that didn't happen. So we can say, well, it hasn't happened yet. For thus saith the Lord, never will David lack a male descendant to succeed to the throne of the house of Israel, nor will the Levitical priests ever fail to have available one of their number to stand before me to present burnt offerings to burnt grain offerings, so cereal offerings in some translations, um, and to offer sacrifices each day. So this is part of a much longer thing. So read Jeremiah and some of the chapters around there as they're talking about what is to come, and in God kind of reiterating his covenant that he made back in Exodus about the priesthood and the offerings. And on all of these situations, it's a forever kind of thing. And in Jeremiah's case, it became extraordinarily specific by saying specifically, line of David, not spiritual, actual line of David, and not a spiritual king, but on the throne of David governing Israel. And then the priesthood, even more specific. Yes, we're talking about the same line of Aaron, and we're talking about the same sacrifices, burnt offerings, and such. This is what Jewish heaven looks like for them. This is what the end goal looks like. It's not spiritual. It's actually doing the sacrifices in the temple with an actual descendant of Levi and an actual descendant of David ruling on the throne. None of this has happened, not even close. So there is further to be said there, but I'm going to cut it off there, and next we'll go to Hebrew. But that's enough of a chunk, and we'll let Dale rebut that.
Okay. Did you also cover sacrifices there or just the priesthood?
Well, in the Jeremiah 33 passage, it also covers sacrifices.
Okay, but like you didn't cover
So if
the
you mean in my point on sacrifices, there's more to be said on sacrifices. Yes, but I don't.
okay. Okay. So I'll,
We can either talk about that or not, if necessary, because that's point six.
I'll wait.
Kind of
Yeah.
important, but we can leave it off if necessary.
Yeah, yeah. I'll leave it off until you make your full argument on that front then. So
Okay.
okay, so on the priesthood, I will admit I think this is the toughest one to deal with of David's objections and stuff. In terms of where is it? In terms of addressing this. So look, it's true that historically speaking, King David's physical descendants after the Babylonian exile stopped literally ruling on the kingdom of Judah's throne and that sort of thing. So that did stop, and that's just the historical fact, whether that fits it or not. Now, is that a contradiction? Kind of thing. So again, the it doesn't really matter about the New Testament understanding at this point because the Old Testament Jews also had to deal with this issue once they were restored after the exile, and that sort of thing. So in the first place, just like everything I've been saying, that the promises about the king as the representative of Israel itself, right? This is what their role said. That's also contingent. It's all these promises are all contingent on is the king being a good boy or a bad boy and obeying God and that sort of thing and doing his duty. And as we know, the end of the Davidic line came because These were wicked, evil, satanic, bad guy kings, and they got what they deserved. They were thrown off the throne, cut off, and brought to the land of Babylon in exile. So again, there's this inherent contingency. So this is not an absolute prophecy. And remember, who is making this prophecy that it's Jeremiah about the throne will never lack someone from David. Obviously, Jeremiah knew. I mean, he's prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem to Babylon. When he's making these prophecies, he's well aware that Babylon has already conquered and taken one of the kings away and replaced him with another son of David, kind of thing. And by the way, David's line genetically continued because the first king was brought. What's his name? Zero. What was okay? The original king. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. But he was brought to Babylon and ruled as a governor and stuff like that. So King David's genes passed on to Jesus, even though they weren't literally sitting on a throne after the exile and that sort of thing. So that handles the physical aspect. And on that front, again, it is consistent with the contingency of the promise of the king. And once again, the word forever doesn't necessarily mean forever in these cases. And in context, even Jeremiah, when he's making this prophecy, clearly didn't mean it in a literal sense, kind of thing. He was also prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem around the same time. And another thing is Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 14 to 16, which is around the same area that I think David was quoting from. It looks
Just
forward
before
to
the reading.
oh, sorry,
Yeah, I was just saying it's just before the reading.
just
The
before,
two
yeah.
verses.
So right afterwards, here's Jeremiah saying, look, I'm looking forward to the time of the righteous branch of David that would rule. This is a clear messianic prophecy kind of thing, right? So this is alluding to the fact that we need this special king who's descended from David to come, and he's making this messianic prophecy. Why would you need that? Aren't the just King David's rule is just going to continue on? No, that's not what he meant. He saw that there would be a future time when the righteous branch or someone of the seed of David would return, aka Jesus the Messiah, and that sort of thing. So even Jeremiah is supporting, I think, this contingent reading here, and not literally saying there will be a literal descendant of David sitting on a literal throne at all times from this point onwards and stuff. That's not what Jeremiah is clearly saying. Now, David, in his article, I don't know if he mentioned it here, but he mentions that the New Testament contradicts the Old Testament on this front because Jesus was not a Levite, right? He was not, he's descended from David. He's not descended from Levi. And so he couldn't be a part of the Aaronic priesthood and that sort of thing. But yet Jesus is our high priest. This is a total contradiction with the Old Testament. No, it's not, because Jesus was a priest under the order of Melchizedek, a king priest. And look, forget about is the New Testament just making stuff up here? No, this precedent was set by King David himself, who functioned as a priest king by wearing a linen ephod and offering sacrifice. He was not descended from Levi or Aaron and stuff like that. So it's clearly not a problem. Jesus was fulfilling the Old Testament. The Levites served their purpose. Their role ended when the temple ended. And the Old Testament was now fulfilled. Their function was over. But we needed the ultimate sacrifice, which we'll get to in number 6. But we needed the ultimate high priest to offer that sacrifice. And that was Jesus, the priest king under the order of Melchizedek, just like King David in the Old Testament functioned as this same thing, this priest king. So there's nothing about Jesus functioning as our high priest and yet lacking the descendancy of being someone who could actually offer sacrifices in the second temple. That's not a contradiction because he was the same as King David. So I see this as fully consistent in terms of the priesthood specifically. David?
Uh,
I,
yeah. So I disagree.
Surprise.
So yeah, so David, uh, talk about some of the roles that he took on, maybe because of the situation of his time. I think that's irrelevant, except to maybe prove my deeper point on a different topic. And so I don't know how much I want to get into, but all of this was just how people saw their relationship with God and the rules in their situation, which means that in a very 10,000-foot generalized view, um, all of this is meaningless. Uh, if David wanted to go into the temple and eat the showbread, he could do it, and then we would justify it later. If someone needed to pick up some sticks on the Sabbath, they'd do it and justify it later. Judaism was good at that. So to think of all of this as some kind of command from God, I think is immature and silly. But that's what we're supposed to think of it as. That's how we're supposed to think of it, that God set down these rules, many of which did not get a trial. If you do it, you die. For instance, if your child, your wife, your best friend try to convince you to go to a church service for some other god, there's no trial. The only time you call in the community is after you've bashed that motherfucker over the head. You don't even hear him out. He doesn't get to finish his sentence. Um, and so that's how important the laws were. Once again, God gives a formula for the fire to be sacrificed. You substitute something, you get zapped. You don't get a trial. These things were very important, very specific until they aren't. So when David's running around hungry, um, then great. When Uzzah tries to steady the Ark of the Covenant because it's about to fall, he gets struck down. But when David and the enemies of David steal the ark and start running around all over the place with it, you can be assured that they weren't following any special rules. They were fine. So I've probably gone too far down that particular road anyway. But when your thing is, oh well, David put on the vestments and became a priest, I would say that that was a false priesthood then, and no one should see that as any kind of example. You mentioned Melchizedek. We'll get there. We're going to Hebrews next. Melchizedek was a fantasy figure. Melchizedek is embarrassing as far as I'm concerned, but I mean, you can say it's a part of the literature I'm supposed to read, but he's barely mentioned in the Old Testament at all. So that I don't know that anyone would know who Melchizedek is. To have such an important callback in Hebrews makes no sense. It's like the second time the name was mentioned. Um, so I find that not very convincing and not at all legitimate. Again, we'll get there. But all of that is irrelevant because Jeremiah clearly says this will be someone of the Aaronic line. Not spiritually. He didn't say this will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek, which is to say, not of the Aaronic line. He said this will be Aaronic line. You're saying that, yeah, he's predicting the destruction of the temple, but he's also predicting, this new covenant where all the promises are going to be fulfilled and the Jerusalem will be built and they will occupy the land and they will get the temple and they'll do the sacrifices every day because that's what the promises led to. It didn't promise this spiritualized idea of we'll eat the cracker and drink the blood. No, they were slaughtering things. They were burnt offerings, and that's what they were envisioning would happen when everything was set right. Will I get to that later if we have time? But the point being, you can't just substitute, even if you say David did it, that won't work for the New Testament writers. because Jeremiah is specific, and you can't just swap out one priesthood for another priesthood when the promise fails and say, see, same thing. It's not the same thing. And we'll see that the first passage we read in Hebrews. But okay, did you have one other thing to
Yeah,
go there or
to keep
moving to
it
the next passage?
next passage. Well, just okay. So just to keep it very quick, then on the you mentioned King David. Thank you, David Johnson. You are a king in my books because you've conceded defeat on this. I'm being provocative on purpose here, just for fun. But uh, I love what you said. So King David, his is an exception because it's of his situation. Ah, so these prophecies, these promises, these commandments are contingent upon specific situations. And in David's case, that was a situation that merited this exception or exemption, rather. Okay, well, what about the situation of being in the Messianic era? Ah, I think that would qualify. That's the Christian claim. Yeah, that qualifies. The law has served its function. We are now here at the era of the Messiah to complete and fulfill Israel's destiny and bring about the redemption of mankind. Yeah, I think that merits having a priest king, just like David, a king Messiah who serves the function of a priest. That's a situation that would merit that as well. So thank you for proving these promises, whatever you say, are situation uh, relative, and David's admitting that in David's case. So why not in terms of the son of David, the
But
Messiah?
I'm not admitting that in David's case. What I'm saying is David broke the law. What I'm saying is that the law didn't seem to apply to David at all. So, for instance, it was a law at that time that if you're caught in adultery, you would be put to death. David was not put to death. Um, and the law is clear. And so this wasn't the law being carried out. This was the law being flagrantly violated uh, because David. That's what it was. No one appointed David a priest. David appointed his own damn self a priest. No one told David he can go in the Holy of Holies and eat the showbread.
Okay,
He was hungry and he just did it.
okay. So
So
I have
you
one.
can't say that this means that the law is relative in that you can just do whatever you want to in any given situation.
Okay, so if that's true, then again, I'm not arguing for a total relativity here, but I am arguing that the situation does matter and stuff. But so if your interpretation is true, this is a breach. David, he gets away. He's breached the law in the same way he clearly breached it. We would agree that he breached it with raping Bathsheba there. Um, Now, here's the thing: when David breached the law, he was scolded. Every Jew subsequent to him, oh, look at David. He's not perfect. He raped Bathsheba. He broke the law, and he had to repent of that, even in the story. So the Jewish narratives, even after David, all recognized that was a breach. But that's not the case when he acted as this priest king. They celebrated. They go, "Wow, what a good guy! See, this just you can do this, and this was good." If what you're saying, if it was a breach, why aren't they scolding David for it? Like the Jews scolded David when he raped Bathsheba.
But
I
when
think
you
there's a
say
difference.
scolded, the punishment wasn't to be scolded. The punishment was to be put to death.
Right, right. But
Uh,
okay.
so the scolding doesn't really. The scolding is part of the breach. That's not the punishment that was supposed to be done.
Yeah, so they clearly broke the law in the case of David. They made a human exception kind of thing, right? But it's the point is they're still frowning on it. They recognize it as a breach, and maybe hypocritically they're not recognizing we should have, technically speaking, we should have stoned him, but we didn't or something like that. But
Well,
that's
the
human beings.
Congress lets Trump get away with murder, and the Congress doesn't do their job. Even the Republican Congress people who agree with Trump still have a job to do that they are not doing. Does that mean that Trump is acting legally? No, that's for future judges to determine, I suppose. So, yeah, David was above the law, and the people were either resigned to it or they were just as lawless as him.
Yeah, but
But they were lawless none the same, nonetheless.
Okay, so your Trump nonsense aside, the point is here. So for the sake of argument, I'm agreeing with you that yeah, these are a bunch of corrupt Jewish politicians. Let's pretend that's correct in the case of David raping Bathsheba. But my point is that the Jews recognized and acknowledged, my goodness, in the story itself, King David himself repents and recognizes, yeah, I screwed up. I
Right,
should
because
not.
that one's
But
embarrassing. Right? It's embarrassing. And so you got to give some nod to, yeah, my bad. But they still flagrantly broke the law. If their consciences were appeased by saying, look, you went too far, he says, ah, shucks, I'm sorry. Okay, and we move
yeah, but
on.
that's the
That is
relevant.
not the law. That's an abrogation of the law. And I understand your point.
Yeah,
It's
because
saying
remember,
he
you
appoints himself a priest.
when it comes
And
to
then
sorry, the last thing just before I forget it, and sorry, I'm interrupting you, so I'm a bad
no,
guy.
no, it's fine. I actually like interrupting Dale better than the monologue Dale.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I just don't want to forget kind of thing. But so you yourself established here that the breaching the law in the specific way that David did, right, as a priest king, or violating these temple laws and Levitical laws was so serious. There's other stories where so he just falls down and he catches it and he's killed immediately. So like you can't say, oh, well, this wasn't embarrassing enough, so that's why they're not scolding David or saying, that was a bad. You got away with it because you're above the law, but you're a bad boy, and that was a sin. No, they're saying, hey, this was good, but it's not due to any kind of bias because they had no problem calling out others in the past when they breached these Levitical laws, even to the point where it's like an accident and someone's just catching the Ark of the Covenant. They got zapped, they got killed kind of thing. So I just don't think your explanation works. And yeah,
Okay, yeah, but you've got David pegged as a hero, and you've got some univocality built in. But I think this proves what David was a thug. If you look at his military career that the Bible goes over, no one reads those books, but that's fine. He's just a thug. Uh, no, he was a fairly successful thug, but that's what he was. And he bullied himself into the throne, and he got away with murder. There was nothing that he could do that would warrant a death penalty or a removal from the throne. There was no God involved with David, unless God was saying, "Yeah, well, I'm going to let him do whatever he wants to." We have left the law completely when we're talking about David and his career as king. An interesting figure indeed, but it still doesn't matter. It doesn't work because Jeremiah didn't, he was not vague in any of this. He said two things, actually three things that we cannot get away from and obscure with lots of other stuff. One, line of David, direct descendant seed DNA. That's what we're talking about. Line of David on the throne. Two, line of Aaron will always forever be there will always be a descendant. And by the way, he's not talking about one person to come and live forever and therefore they're always a descendant. This reads like he's talking about a succession, that there will always be someone to succeed to the throne, always be someone to succeed to the high priesthood. uh, Again, didn't happen. And three, the sacrifices. Uh, he speaks very specifically about the sacrifices. Could have gone into more detail, but here it just introduces sacrifices, burnt offerings, which I'm thinking might be animal, grain offering, and whatever the other thing was. Um, and those would happen daily. Um, a continuation. These things didn't happen, and there's no way to really and legitimately spiritualize these things because they're specific. If Jeremiah had been vague, we might have had wiggle room. Jeremiah wasn't vague, he was specific. He had a particular idea of what was going to happen, and that idea was proven wrong. Shall we go to Hebrews 7? and you can rebuttal on this side of it because it's the same stuff. I just wanted to give you a chance to talk directly about Isaiah. So I'll read this quickly. For it is clear that our Lord was descendant from Judah. Okay, this is the Hebrews writer. I might slip and call him Paul. We don't actually know that it was Paul. We don't believe it was Paul, but it was either Paul or a student of Paul, perhaps, because he talks like Paul. But he's maybe even more strident here. For it is clear that our Lord was a descendant of Judah, a tribe about which Moses said nothing in regard to priests. In fact, it's not that Moses didn't say anything. He said specifically it's going to be Aaron and no one else. So this is not a matter of Moses' silence. Moses spoke very clearly on this as we read. Back to the passage, this becomes even more obvious now that another priest has arisen, one like Melchizedek, who was one not through a legal requirement concerning physical descendants, but by the power of an indestructible life, for it is attested of him, you are priests forever according to the order of Melchizedek. This is Hebrews 14 through 17. This part about Melchizedek, I think, is a Hail Mary. Like I said, the second time he's even mentioned in the Bible, but this is the Hebrews writer having to acknowledge the elephant in the room. We're going to continue a priesthood. We don't have any Levites. I admit it. Okay, you got me, but you don't, because we're going to pull out this Melchizedek character and say Jesus is like this guy, and so screw the line of Levi. This is him. Don't worry about the line of Levi. Except Jeremiah said absolutely worry about the line of Levi. If this was univocal, Jeremiah could have easily said there will be a priest on the throne, but different, and you'll see. He could have just said there will be a priest on the throne who has the authority to do these sacrifices, but he didn't. He specifically envisioned a line of Aaron, and this Hebrew writer specifically has to address the problem by saying, fuck it. That's the interpretation of this writer. You might read it differently. I'm going to throw just a couple of more passages and I'll read them, because once again, this is a part of the longer conversation and I don't want to break this up all that much. Now, the one about whom these things was said belonged to a different tribe from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is as clear that our Lord was described, descendant, from Judah, a tribe about which Moses said nothing. Of the priests, I'm just going to skip down a bit more. For when there is any change in the priesthood, there must also be a change in the law. This is still in that reading in Hebrews 7. So it kind of crescendos into this verse right here. For when there is any change in the priesthood, there must be a change in the law. The Hebrews writer is acknowledging Levitical priesthood is dead. There is a change in priesthood. Just stop it. Just stop whatever you're waiting on to happen for the future. It's not gonna stop it. We have a new priesthood, and as far as the law, and I think implied the promises, forget it. Forget it. It's never going to happen, because when you change the priesthood, you change the freaking law. And so we just get the record scratch, rip out the page, and we start a new book. This is what they had to do, because they recognized that the old book was done for. It's over. They were not looking forward to those promises being fulfilled anymore. They just had to cut it off and start new. And that's what you read in Hebrews 7, and it can't be more clear or more direct because he references this stuff that I'm talking about throughout the reading. And this is his explanation of what they're doing now.
All right. So yeah, I kind of already addressed this. I got ahead of us when I mentioned the Melchizedek based in the Old Testament example of King Priest David and that sort of thing. So we already addressed that. But yeah, the Hebrew author of the Hebrews is basically talking about, yeah, we need a better priesthood. Not that pitiful one in the Levites. He's not saying throw it away. He's embracing the Old Testament. He's very Jewish. His audience are Hebrews and Jews and stuff who are resonating with everything he's saying. And this was very effective for them in converting them to Christianity and making them see that yeah, the Old Testament has been completed now; it's fulfilled. So uh, this is the same answer that I say. Yes, you need a new law. We are under a new covenant, under the Messianic era. The Old Testament, whereby you had to have this physical temple, the priesthood, and all these things, they had served their purpose. They were done. They will be remembered, and their legacy lives on forever through Jesus' actions as the ultimate sacrifice, which brought about completion and brought in the new law, the new covenant. We no longer have to follow the Old Testament law. We're not
Except it
obligated.
didn't.
Sorry.
Except it didn't. You're saying the priesthood thing, it was fulfilled.
Yeah.
Um, and that gave the permission for a new thing. There's one piece of this that I failed to read. I just want to punch it in here because this is where it matters, I think. If perfection was therefore achieved through the Levitical priesthood on the basis of which the law was given to the people, what need would there have been for another priest to rise up according to or Melchizedek? Well, let me answer that question for you. Hebrews, anonymous Hebrew writer. That is clear sophistry. There wasn't a need for it. You're just declaring a need for it because the promise failed. So it's not because it was imperfect, it was because it didn't come true. Um, and so before you say that Jesus fulfills um, the promise of the Levitical priests
Mhm.
and the king, I think you have to have a fulfillment before that. Not Jesus can't be the fulfillment of that part because he's not a Levite. And you can say we're leaving that now and doing a new thing because that last thing wasn't fulfilled. But you can't say the last thing was fulfilled and then now we're going to Jesus. Once again, you got to pick a lane because what was promised was Aaron as high priest, his lineage.
Yeah. Except
You
for
gotta you gotta mark out when that stopped happening and ask yourself, okay, did that fulfill the promise? Because if you're saying that Jesus is that fulfillment, now you're just you are, I think, making hash of both testaments because Jesus wasn't in this Old Testament as one to fulfill the Levitical role,
he was in the Old Testament.
and
He followed the Old Testament law and he brought about its completion and perfection. His sacrifice was a part of that, right? Because the Old Testament order, part of that sacrifice accepted other people. We already established that with King David and
oh, it
priest
there
king.
was
So they Jesus' sacrifice is what brought about the completion of the Old Testament need to have sacrifices. He's finished it. He's performed that job.
let me make sure I understand. You're saying that David properly fulfilled the order that only a Levite could serve as priest. That wasn't actually a problem.
Yes, correct,
Okay,
because there are
so I
exemptions
would say
from.
that any idea of Old or New Testament law that you have is um, abolished and of none effect. It makes no sense at all because in my situation, um, I can say that I can do anything that I want to and say that makes sense of my situation, and the law will accommodate that.
No,
Uh,
but there are
Absolutely
limits.
would. If a homosexual priest says it's okay that I'm homosexual and I'm a priest, because that is the situation that I am in the times that we live in, and we can just do anything as long as the situation calls for it, and call that uh, equal to the law, then great. You have no law. You
So
have no.
no, but it's not in complete chaos like that. There are strict circumstances under which it's okay, right? And in the case of King David, you already kind of said, like, well, his situation, and I don't know what you think his
I was
situation
saying that mockingly. There is no special situation. There's no reason that Aaron shouldn't have been.
like later Old Testament Jews thought that it was cool and it was okay. They didn't see it the way you do.
Okay, these same people that were terrible sinners in the story, we're
I'm
going
talking
with
about
them.
righteous
The ones who didn't
prophets.
keep the law.
No, I'm talking about righteous prophets, and so none of them called out what King David did. Um,
No one could write a long enough book to accommodate all the bad things that David did.
they managed to include Bathsheba and a prophet scolding him and demanding he repent for that. So
Right.
they
All
could
they
have done
all they did for David was say that he could get away with anything, that he was a bully and a thug, and God didn't give a shit. That's the story
that.
of David.
That's not the story of David according to the Old Testament, and that's what's relevant for your claim. It's not what you as an atheist think. Of course, you think it's all BS and stuff like that, and that they're just making it up as they go. But I'm trying to
They
say
are
the New Testament
clearly
is
just
consistent.
making it up as they go.
Well,
They
again, okay, let me put it this way in conditional terms. Then, if you as the audience admit that I've proven my case that for the Old Testament biblical Jew living at the time of David and afterwards, they didn't see this as a problem. None of them said David acted as a priest king. He shouldn't do that. He was not a son of Levi. He didn't have the right to do that, or a son of Aaron didn't have the right to do that. No, none of them raised it as an issue. They thought it was valid, and that didn't violate this general rule that yeah, in order to be a priest, you had to be of the line of Aaron and stuff like that.
general rule. That was a
There's no
very
problem.
specific rule.
Well, if there's an exemption here with King David, that means clearly there's at least one or more cases where it's okay to not be a son of Aaron and perform as a priest. And to the Jewish mind, that's okay.
I
So
don't think
all
that
the
it does
Christian,
show that, though. I understand your point.
but let me
Um,
finish this one last thing.
okay.
For the audience, you're the judge here, and all the Christian is doing is going, great. Jesus also, the Messiah, the fulfillment of everything, right, is claimed to be the fulfillment of the ultimate sacrifices for our redemption. That's also a situation that would qualify as an exemption, just like King David's. Whatever King David's situation was, maybe we don't know what was so special about him. Why did he get to perform in this way, or something like that? But it makes sense that Jesus would also qualify as the Messiah, as this righteous branch that's from the seed of David, kind of thing.
Let me ask you a question, a clarifying question. I'll try not to make it a speech. Uh, I'm sorry. When Jeremiah uh, promised uh, a descendants of the line of Aaron making sacrifices every day in this new and perfected temple, do you believe that that was ever literally fulfilled? That the line of Aaron continued on for whatever season it takes to reach, you know, eternal or forever, because this is what this is all about. Do you think that there was some renewal of the line of Aaron making these sacrifices daily?
Okay. And do you mind just give me the specific text just so I can like read it in full context?
Yeah, let me just roll back. uh, here is Jeremiah 33, and I simply picked up at 17 uh, and
Just
18. This could be important later with the next point and maybe our last point, depending on how the time goes. But um, if you just take a plain reading of these verses, um, there will be, uh, let's see, nor will the Levitical priest ever fail to have available one of their number to stand before me to present burnt offerings, to burn cereal offerings, and to offer sacrifices each day. Do you believe that Jeremiah, first of all, that he meant that literally that that would happen? And do you believe it actually happened? Or was Jeremiah wrong in how he believed it?
Yeah, so there's inherent in this prophecy are the is the contingency and stuff like that. And it's obvious. This is what I was arguing before about how Jeremiah knows. I mean, this is in Jeremiah 33. Read the entire chapter. It's in the context.
Uh,
He knows, hey, your kings are done. You're gonna be conquered by Babylon and taken into exile. The temple will be destroyed. He prophesies this. So he knows the Levitical priests, it's not literally true that they're not gonna ever lack a man. He knows that they
but
will
but
lack.
he thought that there would be another temple.
Correct. And he
So
was,
and he thought it would be a literal temple where literal people would do these literal things. And I'm asking you, from a historical perspective and your understanding and your beliefs, did that happen in any way that meets what Jeremiah was expecting?
well, I mean, obviously, yeah, they restored the temple. And I mean, there was 500 years before Jesus came and stuff where Levitical priests performed their roles of giving offerings and stuff. So,
Okay, so you believe that this history, I won't even challenge that right now. You believe that that satisfied this passage in that it did happen exactly the way it was suggested. Because it sounded like before you believe that it didn't happen and only was what is it? What does it mean to these this when it says "do not disturb"? I mean, what does that mean? Um,
so
okay, so did it since Jeremiah was looking forward to a time that this would happen. My question is, do you think it happened? It sounds like you said it did happen the way he intended, and then something else spiritually happened that Jesus did. But if it happened as Jeremiah said it, then we don't need Jesus for that. Jesus is not the fulfillment of anything here. It would have been fulfilled without Jesus, and that means that the New Testament writer, the Hebrews writer, is probably wrong. Or when Jesus says he's going to fulfill the law, maybe this is not what he meant. But you can't have it again both ways. This either happened and was fulfilled, or it didn't fulfilled physically, or it didn't happen and was fulfilled spiritually.
okay.
And
Okay. So
I need you to make
sure.
a choice.
So if I'm going to make a choice, reading everything in context from this specific thing, it's clearly a messianic prophecy about the branch of David, Jesus the Messiah, and it's talking about the day, behold, the day is coming, when it's kind of got Jesus in mind here. And given the fact that it's not historically true that any man from David, descendant, sat on the throne of House of Israel, I would probably take this in the same way, kind of thing, as I did with the king sitting on the
Okay.
throne. And I know some people think that there's going to be a third temple. This is another valid Christian interpretation where Levitical priests will continue to make sacrifices and stuff like that. I'm not I'm not sure about that. I think Ezekiel's third temple is probably false. It's not meant to be taken literally. Kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I think you have
So,
to believe that. If you believe that Jesus fulfilled it, then it's fulfilled. There would be no point of a third temple. What are we doing? You're going to fulfill it again? You're going to fulfill it again after that? Will there be a fourth temple, a fifth temple? Um,
Yeah,
so you
they
either got to believe that it was fulfilled or it will be fulfilled, but you can't double dip and have it both ways.
I think you can, the way like Michael Brown explains it. Again, it's not the view that I think is correct. Like it is weird to me, but I think you can make it work where it's consistent with Jesus being the one true sacrifice. And then, you make sacrifices up in heaven or something like that that aren't really efficacious, but they're just symbolic of what Jesus's act was and stuff like that. Um,
I
that's not my view. I'm just saying that's this some Christians
what are we doing?
some Christians believe they take the thing literally, and yeah, Christians after the end day, after Judgment Day, we will continue to slaughter animals as sacrifices, Thanksgiving offerings, and stuff like that, in
In
remembrance.
Jeremiah, literally, that has to happen.
I don't think it does. I think that again, there's this inherent contingency. So I would rely the same answer I gave about no man sitting on the throne of David as king. That would be the same interpretation about the Levitical priests here, kind of thing, that has that
Okay,
built
so if
in.
it's a contingency, let me make sure I understand that. If it's a contingency on whether they kept the law or not, whether they sinned or not, you can always say, well, they sinned, and so this we can just erase this promise. But you're not erasing the promise. You're saying that Jesus fulfilled it. So if Jesus fulfilled it, then you can't use the contingency option and say, well, it wasn't valid because they sinned. If it wasn't valid, then Jesus wouldn't need to fulfill it. So uh, it was either a going concern to Jesus' day or it wasn't. And if it had been eliminated because of their sin, then Jesus died for nothing.
I don't think so. Like I said, it's because of this verse about the king of Israel. Not even the Levitical priest is not really that much of an issue, but for me, it's the king. And the fact that we know there was no descendant of David who sat on the throne historically post the Babylonian exile.
Right. So then the
And
promise is
that's
done. But why do we need to fulfill it?
the promise is done.
Yeah, because your contingency argument is the people sinned, and so God doesn't have to do it. Okay, God doesn't have to do it. We take it off the table. So why is it back on the table in Jesus' day?
I guess the truthful answer is I don't know. I need to study commentaries on this particular verse and stuff. But like I said, in terms of this show, your interpretation that you're giving is clearly false. And every Jew in the Old Testament, including Daniel and every prophet, they said you're wrong. It doesn't matter that we lack a king. That's not a breach of this promise. And in fact, this is a messianic prophecy about the seed of David, the ultimate king and priest, Jesus.
Yeah, I'm not I'm
That's
not
that's like
debating those guys though. If I were debating those guys, I would tell them to their face that they're wrong. I am
Yeah,
simply
but you can't
litigating
do that because your
I'm
point here
litigating
is
the
to say that
text.
the New Testament
Well, they
violates the Old Testament. So the prophets are what matter, not what you say this verse means, kind of thing. And
well, and
I'll
I'm reading the
admit,
prophets.
sorry.
I'm reading the prophets. And so this the contingency argument, I think, is really the thing to wrestle with. And it's something that I talked about early on in the series. Um, you got one or two choices, but I don't think you can have them both. So God makes a promise. Never mind whether it's a moral promise or not. Okay. I'm with you there. The people either do their part and the promise stands or they don't and it doesn't stand. Okay. But that's where we seem to have a problem because they don't do their part ever. And the part where Jesus says where God says he'll remember their sins no more, uh, that doesn't seem to happen either. Either that, or he doesn't remember their past sins, but they have new sins and current sins, and so that goes on. So I don't even know what the point of remembering their sins no more is. And so what I am saying is, if because of their sins the covenant is broken and the promises are null and void, Why do we have this continuing theme throughout the Old and New Testament of fulfilling dead promises?
Okay, so you know what? So this is the last thing I'm going to say about this. Yeah, because everything I'm seeing just from my quick Google searches, clearly I need to research this. I will admit defeat. I think that you've won this particular argument. Again, just with my limited knowledge of this verse, responding off the cuff on the spot.
No, I don't want you to
Um,
admit defeat. There's no defeat.
no,
That's
no,
it. That's when we
because
first started talking.
because
There's not a win scenario for me.
yeah,
There's not a win scenario for you. That's what makes a conversation interesting.
yeah,
We
yeah.
could just say things,
But,
and
but
it's
yeah,
okay.
no, like I think it's important to note that like okay, so this is a good point that I don't know the answer because everything I'm in my quick Google searches here, it is fulfilled through Jesus Christ. It is this obvious messianic prophecy. The only thing is like obviously it can't be literal because it's talking about the Levitical priest. So I want to do more research into that. Like what how does Jesus say fulfill and the Levitical priests should not lack a man kind of thing, even in the role of the Melchizedek priest king. So yeah, I just want to see what actual scholars say about that and see if it makes sense. Or if Christians listening in the audience, if you guys might have any idea about Jeremiah chapter, how does Jesus fulfill Jeremiah 33, verse 18, which specifies Levitical priests? I'd like to see an answer. So I'll just admit, yeah, I don't know. I think you might have got me, at least in this moment, on that one.
That's fine. I can tell you, as someone who's been looking at this for over a decade, um, I've never found a good answer. So, if you find one, please come back and let's do a follow up on that. I'd be glad to talk about it. But I looked as hard as I know that you're going to look for a long time. Uh, and
What
so
were
let's just quick.
well, just to steal, man, since you have done more in-depth research on this particular issue, like what were so I clearly it's fulfilled in Jesus Christ. That's what all the commentaries I'm seeing are saying. But like how exactly? What are the how do they say he fulfills this thing of the Levitical priest? Did you see
They
any
don't.
answers?
They don't. In fact, you gave the best answer. That's what you're going to encounter when you encounter any kind of answer at all. Part of the problem is that Christians below the scholarship level don't talk about this at all because they don't know it, because they haven't read their Bible. And I don't even mean that in a derogatory way. They just haven't. And they don't read the Old Testament. Oh, it's the Old Testament. They have no idea what Jeremiah said. Uh, and so it's not a problem for them. Um, it's never a problem, and they don't read Hebrews either. Let me just tell you, Hebrews has got to be the least read book in the New Testament, way less than Revelation, um, because they don't understand it. Because Hebrews is talking about the Old Testament and the law, and when they see that, their eyes glaze over, and it's like, yeah, we don't have to do that. Let's get to Revelation. Um, so in scholarship, I mean, the best you can do is what the Hebrew writer did. You just say, okay, you throw your hands up and you go with that. And maybe, because there's in scholarship, there's some mystery to why Hebrews is even in the New Testament. A little bit like, maybe why Esther is in the Old Testament. Hebrews is a little bit of a mystery there. And it could be, I suspect that Hebrews is in the New Testament specifically to give this explanation, because it is very clear that at the time of the Hebrews writer, there were still Jews who did know the Bible saying, hang on, the priest has to be a Levite. And the Christians back then were as stumped as you are today. And so one of them just authoritatively stood up and said, heck, here's an explanation, done. Judaism is dead, Christianity lives. And because there were no better explanations, I suspect that's why we have Hebrews in the canon.
Well,
But if you're
what it,
trying to find an answer from the Old Testament to get to where the Hebrews writer is, there's no way to do it.
so yeah, I just totally disagree with your generalization of the. So just because I don't know the answer to this specific issue in Jeremiah 33:18, I think Hebrews is brilliant and has the right answer, a brilliant answer for the general issue, and I think he's right. But yeah, I just will
I
say
used to think
I'm
that
gonna
too.
I'm gonna look up the answer for this specific thing that I don't know, and yeah, maybe I'll post it up in the comments if I find something, and or you can post it up in on the SNS boards. But for
You and
now,
I may be the only two people in our audience who's actually read Hebrews multiple times.
I
So,
love Hebrews. It's one of my
uh,
favorites. That and I love Romans as well, and First Corinthians, I think, are my
if
favorite.
I'm going New Testament, I'd go James. Um, that's just me.
James, yeah,
Uh,
he's not my favorite, but he's
yeah.
good. They're all good. They're all inspired. They're better than me, but
Maybe we could do a palate cleanser one day and talk about, you know, some of our favorite stuff in the Bible and why. So I
sure.
think
Yeah,
that would be interesting.
yeah.
So let's see if we can go quickly through here because, as I say, this is a kind of a building on. I'll skip the sacrifices just for time, but the part on reunification again, I covered that a lot during the series. I'm not going to recapitulate it all, but the short version of the story is the southern kingdom, Judah, and the northern kingdom, Israel. Um, two kingdoms. And the conceit is that at some point they were united and then they got broken up. You'll see a lot about the thuggery of David if you want to dive more into that. I think that it is a conceit, though, that has never been historically true. I don't think there ever has been a united kingdom. And what we have are ideologies of why these people are so much alike but separate and divided in that war. Um, but that said, you have two kingdoms, and that's a problem for God and the story and so forth, for their history, for their identity. And so, what you have in the Old Testament may be more prevalent than any other storyline in the Bible, is the unification of the two tribes or the two kingdoms. That's the whole thing. When you talk about bringing people together and salvation, it really springs from the whole divided kingdom thing. It's all, I think, a reference to that. It is not talking about us today at all. It's always talking about them, the kingdom. But there's a problem because the kingdom is supposed to be one, and the kingdom is throughout the Bible too. So I'm just skipping verses. You can read the write up. I guess I'll publish this thing. Read the section. When Jesus comes around, his whole mission, I contend, was related to the divided kingdom. He talks about um, the lost sheep of Israel uh, in a few different places in the New Testament as his ministry. He's come to seek and save the lost. Well, that's a stupid statement if you don't understand it the way I'm suggesting, because everybody's lost. You don't have to seek anybody. Just look around. That person right there, lost. How about that one? Lost. No, he's talking about very, very specifically this prophetic um, fixation on the kingdoms. And so much of the prophecies, when I say prophecies, I mean from of the prophets in the Old Testament. It's talking about this, and so we the passage in Jeremiah talks about the two sticks. You may have heard of that if you're listening, even if you haven't read about it. This is very specifically in the text. You can read it. Ephraim, the northern kingdoms, and the southern kingdoms, and how God is going to take these two kingdoms together and bind them together and make one stick. And this has been the promise throughout. And so when I wanted to make sure that this was represented in this write up, because this is the point of it all. The point of the story is not about David. The point of the story is not about Levites. The point of the story isn't about temples. The point of the story is bringing God's people together, all in full relationship. The Garden of Eden, that's when things get separated, and we can look at that and say, this is a metaphor for the Jews, which is probably correct. And so the whole thing has been, how do we put it back together? It's been chasing that. And so when Jesus comes around, we know that the promises, the many, many promises made about reuniting the kingdoms, and Jeremiah is just one of them, it hadn't happened in Jesus' day. So we have to acknowledge and confess that we can't say all of the promises had been fulfilled before Jesus. That's absurd, because they were not unified then. So it's not just temples and priests and Levites. Okay. This main thread, the thing that Jesus was devoted to, hadn't happened yet. And so, if what Jesus is saying when he says, I don't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, I think that this would have been maybe the thing he had foremost in line. Israel, the time when Jesus weeps, what is he weeping about? He's weeping about the condition of Israel and how they won't come together through him. So the promises were, as of that time, unfulfilled. And Jesus is going to die, and he's made it his mission. So he dies. Years later, decades later, it's still unfulfilled. The Jews are still divided. Israel is still divided, and we can get into how it's gotten spiritualized through the writings of Paul and others. But it's very clear to everyone that this thing ain't happening. It didn't happen, and ain't gonna happen. And so we've got to figure out a way rhetorically to make it happen. And so, since Jesus is our hero and he's the one that we've got to do everything through, he's got to be the priest, even though he's of the wrong line. He's got to be the sacrifice and the king, and he's got to be everything. He's got to be all of it. The lamb that's killed and the scapegoat. He's got to be all of that. Now he's also got to be the reunification of Israel. Because why? Because they got nothing else to lean on. Because if they don't, every part of their religion is a lie. There is no God. There never has been. All the promises are dead. We've got to make them work. And we only got this one tool, and it's Jesus. And so everything is a nail. And Jesus is the hammer. And that's pretty much the whole story of this. So when it comes to the reunification of Israel, we can say it's reunified. I mean, rhetorically, you can say anything. Well, but he spiritually saved them. That wasn't the promise, though. They would be coming back into an actual physical nation. They would be physically taking over land that they can't do. They would be physically building a temple that would last forever. They would physically have a line of Aaron, a line of David. They would physically be making sacrifices. All of these things, if anything, the prophets are univocal about this stuff. And this is all of the stuff. This is the whole reason, the whole project of the New Testament is to somehow spiritualize all of that stuff. Remember, there's like 400 years between the last of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And we got to find a way to wrap all of that up and make it spiritual and keep God a going concern. Because if the Jews needed an identity, it was after the destruction of the temple. They could have been simply crushed as a people. And I think the story um, is what helped a lot of them move on. And it became something that the Jews never intended. It became Christianity, and that became a thing that no one could have predicted. And we have what we have today. But um, as far as sorry, the unification of Israel, it's probably one of the biggest disconfirmations of the Old Testament and the most obvious ploy of the New Testament to spiritualize everything because it just never happened. It can never happen. And in order to keep it going, you just have to say some crap and say Jesus did it. And we're never talking about actual blood Jews. So you can take that as everything I have to say about that point, and you can even take it as my closing statement, unless you want to go further into sacrifices. But people are always free to just read the damn write up.
Okay, so never trust a naturalist atheist to read the Bible when it comes to things like the lost sheep and stuff like that. So David is correct, half correct, that yeah, Jesus himself speaks of lost sheep, in which he's referring to the northern kingdom being restored and with the southern kingdom of Judah. And there is a political reunification in mind, but it's not just that. It's both and. It's obvious. Everybody admits there's a spiritual restoration that's more important. Even if you're Jewish, the Old Testament prophecies, it's a physical, but also this spiritual restoration. And that's why when they go into the exile, it's not just this physical exile. Hey, I'm out of this land. I'm at this spatial coordinate versus this one. No, that's part of it. But the main punishment is the spiritual exile. You're no longer in covenant with God, in this communion with God. And that's why you need to restore the relationship. So that's what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the lost sheep. It's spiritual and physical. He uses this term to refer to the northern tribes of Israel, but also unbelieving Jews, unrepentant Jews in general and stuff. And he wants to restore Jews and Gentiles, obviously, as we learn, but in this context, Jews from all the different tribes and bring them together. So this first, the way God operates is he has to have and that's why Jesus talks about the northern and southern kingdom in context of parables of restoration, right? Like the rebellious son, for example, the prodigal son. These are parables about restoration. And it's not all just physical. Not even the Old Testament Jews would say that. No, there's this spiritual dimension of restoration first. You have to fix the relationship between God and man first. And only then will the physical consequences come about. So Jesus did set about doing that during his first coming. He wanted to go out and preach to all the Jews and then the Gentiles and bring them in and spiritually restore them first. And then at his second coming, we're going to see the physical fulfillment of a united Israel kind of thing, where we have this new nation of God, and the boundaries are so large where it covers all of the prophesied boundaries which haven't come to pass yet. But it's going to be this glorious new Jerusalem and a glorious new nation of Israel, totally restored, both spiritually and physically. So it's just not true. It's not just only physical. That's only the only thing that's in mind. No, read the text that David just mentioned. There's spiritual and physical restoration is what's in mind here. And that's who he's talking about with the lost sheep. It's not just the lost people from the 10 northern tribes only. It's also there are lost sheep even within the house of Judah, unbelieving Jews and stuff like that, and obviously, as we know later on, the Gentiles too. Um, so yeah, Jesus perfectly fulfills these things. Once we understand that the theme here is restoration or reunification, repairing that broken relationship or covenant between God and these bad Jews, in the northern kingdom, but also in the southern kingdom too. Um, so yeah, there's no contradiction here. And in terms of the physical restoration of the land aspect, that will happen at Jesus' second coming. Um, So yeah, he's made the down payment with the spiritual restoration. He's converted Jews from the diaspora in all directions, east, west, south, and north. Um, I guess just in terms of sacrifices, the only other thing, oh shoot, I closed it. Okay. Uh okay, it's if you don't mind, hang on. Here it is. Okay, perfect. Um, so me and David have gone with sacrifices. I had the same answer as the temple. I won't reiterate that. Like sacrifices were clearly meant to be temporal, and that was not a problem for Old Testament Jews. Daniel was not upset that the covenant had been breached because he was living in exile in Babylon and he could no longer offer sacrifices at the temple. No, he saw a restoration of that, and that was a continuation of the Old Testament covenant. So in terms of the sacrifices, the one thing I want to add that's new is that, again, remember my thing, the pleroo, the completion. Jesus brings about and fulfills the purpose of the temple, the purpose of the sacrifices in terms of restoring our relationship with God. Now, inherent in the sacrifices, animals, every Jew in the world knew they're incomplete. They're not good enough. They don't work. This isn't made up by Hebrews. Every Jew in the world in the Old Testament recognized this. And this is why they needed annual sacrifices. You had to keep doing it over and over again, nonstop. If it was good enough to atone for your sins, like in the way Jesus was as an ultimate sacrifice, you would do it once and you'd be done. But that's not the case. And biblical scholars have noted down what is it that you actually need to be a real sacrifice? Why is it Jesus fulfills these, whereas the animals, they're just empty tutors? So there's 5 to 6 features. Number one, this you must have a common nature because it's a human nature to use Christianizing language, but to use more general biblical language, look, the sinner and the substitute, if you're going to have somebody as your substitute, they must be human beings like you. Otherwise, they can't experience the punishment and experience the restoration properly. And that's why an animal will always never be good enough. They're at best a temporary or provisional fix, a little band-aid, but you need surgery. Number two, you need the free consent of the substitute. That is essential. Animals cannot freely consent, and that's why they were never seen as good enough. They were only temporary provisional means of atonement. Three, the substitute must have power over his own life so that he may rightfully determine what is done with it. Well, that sounds like Jesus. Animals don't have the power to raise themselves from the dead after you slaughter them, but Jesus did. Next, number four, uh, the substitute must be sinless and perfect so that he doesn't have to offer satisfaction for himself as well as others. So the substitute must be sinless. Now, animals are sinless; they would qualify there, but they're sinless in a way that they're not moral agents, and because of that, there's a deficiency. They haven't lived or chosen to live a sinless life, and in that way, they're deficient. They're not really a substitute to us, human beings who've chosen sin. Oh, my substitute, human being who hasn't chosen to sin. Animals don't do that. They made no choice. They're sinless because they're stupid, basically. They don't have that dimension. Number five, the substitute has to have the power to bear all of the punishment. And on this front, even the most Old Testament Jew, the prophets that David quotes, so Jeremiah and Isaiah, they say no, animals cannot bear all of the punishment. They are inherently limited, both in terms of the types of sin that they have. You have to have all these different types of sacrifices performing different functions and that sort of thing. So they don't even at one time contain all the punishment. And secondly, they can't die for all of the punishment temporally, extended through time, kind of thing. You need this never-ending series of animal sacrifices, and it's always incomplete. It's always impartial. Finally, number six, the substitute is able to convey or apply at least one or more of, so this comes from me, one or more of the 4 beneficial consequences obtained, right? So as David and I have debated the atonement, we know that I say that The reason it works for Jesus and not animals is because Jesus can dwell in our hearts. He underwent the punishment and then can apply the redeeming qualities, right? Remember, one of the beneficial consequences of punishment is it redeems the sinner. Well, Jesus, when he dwells in our heart, he can apply that to us and change me through the sanctification process. Animals can't do that. They can't apply. Okay, somebody died in my place. Maybe that works forensically or legalistically. God can declare me innocent because some lamb is dead. But that does nothing to actually redeem or atone for my sins and change me into a righteous person. Animal sacrifices are incomplete and can't do that. But Jesus' sacrifice fulfills the purpose and actually not only lets me off the hook legalistically, but redeems and restores my character to a sinless state. Um, so, yeah, my main point here is sacrifices were always seen inherently as temporal, temporary, provisional means or band aid solutions to address the problem of sin and to restore a relationship with God. It's only through Jesus that it's completed. It reaches its intended purpose of that reconciliation. So that's it. Yeah, that's the end of all my points.
Okay, let me then respond. I was prepared to let this one go,
I'll
but
let you have the last word. Don't worry, but go ahead.
since you're prepared for it, I'll respond. I'm prepared to respond. In fact, I'll just read the couple of relevant paragraphs from the write-up. So I start with a scripture verse, and he has entered once for all into the sanctuary, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. We find this new blood sacrifice nowhere in the Hebrew scripture. This was not a part of any messianic expectation of which I am aware. For them, this is a New Age cult and not the fulfillment of anything. We don't really need a reminder of the various sacrifices, but in case you, uh, in case one is needed, look again at the end of the reading provided from Jeremiah regarding the Levitical priesthood. There is a mention of what that priest would be doing, namely daily sacrifices. At no point was there any expectation that the sacrifices would end or change. This is one of the things that makes Jeremiah 33 so central to my case, because he didn't just say there would be Levitical priests. He didn't just say that they would be forever. He said what they would be doing. And remember, this is the end game in their vision. This is the rebuilt temple. This is the one where the Holy One is. This is where all the marbles are. Okay, this is what we're looking forward to. This is what we're going to fulfill. And so he talks about this priest and what the priest does. And what the priest does is offer daily sacrifices. So it's one thing to Christianize and theologize and say the sacrifices just weren't good enough. But when God set up the sacrificial system, it was good enough. It was absolutely good enough. At no point was it, oh, that these are just temporary, but when we get the real thing ready, that'll be fine. Now, I did mention, and I keep trying not to mention too much, that the Old Testament writers are not at all univocal, but I think even they would say, oh, the sacrifices are still important. Even the one who says God does not desire sacrifice but mercy, uh, even that person would say, well, I misspoke. God actually does require sacrifice. He actually does. Their expectation was that the sacrifices would continue, and Dale is correct that this is a both and the sacrifices and the right heart. But he wasn't saying what you should have is the right heart, and that will replace the sacrifices. Nothing was going to replace the sacrifices. My final thought on this, because the New Testament writers, they have no choice, and maybe even later Old Testament writers. That's a one for academics to debate. But the New Testament writers, certainly, they had no choice. They had to poo-poo the sacrifices because they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it because the temple burnt, priests dead, uh, can't do sacrifices. So they have to come up with some kind of workaround, some spiritualization to say, well, we don't really need sacrifices anymore. The sacrifices, their purpose has been done. But that wasn't true of the Old Testament writers. Their vision for the end state when things are perfect, have them making sacrifices. So we know that they, at least some of them, longed for the sacrifices just to be pure and correct. But my question for the audience is, what is this game really all about? I mean, if Jesus is the sacrifice, if the blood of bulls and goats could never get the job done, and God knew this, could never work. We got to wait until Jesus comes and dies on a cross. Then why the heck didn't the story start with Jesus? From the moment the fruit was eaten, before Adam and Eve could pack their bags and get to Saskatchewan, why didn't we get Jesus sacrificing then? The one and only sacrifice that would fix it all. But we get it at the end of the story and not the beginning of the story when it would have counted. When God finally says, okay, I'm going to do something about this sin. I'm going to set up a sacrificial system. Why didn't he send Jesus then and do a sacrifice that was going to work instead of one that was just going to create more drama? Because they didn't think they needed any other kind of sacrifice. And this God, if he thought that he needed some other kind of sacrifice, surely he would have done it in the first place instead of this two-step, three-step, eternal step process. And as far as my closing remark, we'll just roll it into this. The story of the Bible, for those who read the Bible, can kind of begin to see this. It's a story of the checks in the mail. Okay. It's a story that starts with a fall. And there's never actually any redemption of it from there. But it's, how are we going to fix this? Okay, and so we do this thing. There's a plan, and that doesn't work. So we go to the next thing. Well, here's what God's promise really meant. Let me add some more details to it. Let me add some more stuff to the covenant. Okay, we do that. We've got this expectation. That doesn't work. That falls through. And we get all the way to the prophets, and they're like, yeah. But he's not slack concerning his promises. He's still going to do it. And here's how it's going to go. That doesn't work. And we get to the New Testament, and all of this stuff is still hanging out there. Check still hasn't been paid, but it's, coming soon. Checks in the mail. Do you know what the Old Testament never mentions? Never mentions a second coming. There's no second coming of a Messiah. It's a weird thing, I think, for Jews to talk about a second coming. There's only one coming. It's the Messiah. He's going to do the things. But we got our coming. There was Jesus. He didn't do squat. So we get checks still in the mail. So we spiritualize everything, but we still know that it's still not there. And so we need a second coming to make it work. So we're waiting around now for the second coming in the same way that the Jews were waiting on the Messiah. They're waiting on this fix, and they keep trying to rhetorically fix it. And we can see that it's still broken, and the promises still aren't there. And we see that with our plain eyes and our open hearts. And we've got to grab onto any story that helps us through the checks in the mail part. One day it's going to happen. It's going to come. Jerusalem's going to come floating out of heaven. You'll see. We're going to go to heaven, and then there won't be any more sacrifices. You'll see. And, that's the whole damn story. And at some point, studying this story over the course of a lifetime, you recognize check's not in the mail. There's no check. There's no Ethiopian prince. We can go home now. Let's go home. Dell, you can have a last word if you like.
Sure. Yeah. I guess one quick point about your thing about sacrifices. So Paul gives us the answer in terms of this metaphysics question. Why? To be a tutor. It was necessary. It was essential. Less souls would have been saved if God did not order or command animal sacrifices, because God said, "Hey, don't worry, 2,000 years from now, I'm going to sacrifice my son. That's all you really need. Don't be like the pagan nations. You don't need to sacrifice." Number one, they would have, we're not following a God like that. He doesn't even order sacrifices. So no one would have been saved. And is all of Israel history and salvation history would have been in jeopardy, and less souls would have been saved as a result. So he had to teach them as a tutor the principle behind the animal sacrifices. I did a debate with Daniel, the Muslim prophet. The prophet has spoken is his name. Daniel, the prophet, has spoken. He's a Muslim, Quran only Muslim. And we debated the atonement. And I got into and proved from the Old Testament about these principles, right? This atonement is only capable through blood. And why blood is symbolic of death, kind of thing, right? The shedding of blood represents death. Death is the wages of sin. That's the punishment for sin, versus blood, lifeblood. When it's not being shed, it's in your body. That's what gives you life. This is the connection. The connection here. Why blood sacrifice? Why is that even necessary at all? Well, insofar as it's symbolic of death, which is the necessary inherent consequence of sin. It's just the symptom of the disease. You sin, that leads to death. That's just the way the world is, kind of thing. That's its natural consequence. So you have to pay that penalty and pay that punishment. So it's setting up as a tutor this principle, a life for life. I have sinned, I deserve death. That's going to be what's going to happen. I can have a substitute take my place and pay that penalty, that consequence for me. Great. They've established that principle, and God had to do it. He had to condescend to the stupidity of the ancient Near Eastern people. They understood temple sacrifices and animal sacrifices. So that's how he taught them this message about Jesus being the ultimate real sacrifice, the one that actually ultimately pays for your sins. It was only Jesus that actually paid not just physical death, but spiritual death in hell. None of the animal sacrifices, none of them suffered hell, relational separation from God for your sins. So Paul gives us the answer. It was a tutor. And if they did not have a tutor, less souls would have been saved. We needed to do the animal sacrifices in order to get to Jesus' death and his sacrifice. So, yeah, if it's my last word, I'll just say thank you to David for an interesting debate. Like I said, this is a critical issue. So many Christians just ignore the Old Testament, and that's not good enough. The Old Testament is literally the foundation of and what gives significance to what Jesus did, and the New Testament. There is no new covenant if there wasn't an old covenant first. So I think it's important, and Jesus tells us he didn't abolish it; he fulfilled the law. So there can't be any provable contradictions. If David proves even one contradiction, that means it's abolishment, and that means Jesus is a liar. So this is a really important and critical debate. So thank you for doing it with me, David.
Thank you for doing it with me. I did a whole series by myself, and I felt like a voice crying out in the wilderness. What I wanted was someone who was nerdy enough to also enjoy a conversation like this. Uh, you're frankly the only one that came to mind.
Awesome. Well, I'm
Because
the only.
nobody cares. I'm not even saying that in a nasty way. There was a time in my life when I didn't care. Um, it's not fun. It's not sexy. It's not easy. There's a lot of academic stuff to wade through that I purposely left out of this series, but tried to leave some breadcrumbs toward for anyone who want it. It's really hard stuff. In terms of the Christian religion, the Old Testament is the hardest part of the Bible, uh, and they've been taught to both respect it as foundational, but ignore it as useless. And that leads to very many really bad things in Christian theology. So it's necessary, probably the most fundamental thing about the Bible. I think the things that we're talking about, the unification of the nations is probably the overarching theme. If I had to give the Bible a theme, and everything kind of points to that. Jesus definitely has a part in this, but I don't think it's possible to understand Jesus until you understand this stuff that led to Jesus and what Jesus was commenting on. Um, so I appreciate you taking the time out of a schedule that I know is very busy to kind of bone up on this stuff and have a good, fruitful conversation. And if you want to come back and follow up with, or do a writing of some of the stuff that is still left on the table to be studied, and I can assure you there are plenty of things that are left on the table for me. Um, the difference between me and you is I've come to the conclusion that we can never know the stuff that I don't know. And I think of the stuff that you don't know, it's in the same category. We can never know it. I don't care how much you study it. It doesn't matter how much, it doesn't matter. Too much time has passed between the people who wrote the Old Testament. We don't even know who they are. There's too much about the cultures that we don't know, that we learn through archaeology and such. And so all we have to debate this stuff really is the writings in the Old Testament themselves. We've got the literature, and then the opinions we can find of people from centuries later.
Yeah, I was just thinking it'll probably be a while or something, but if you wanted to do a round two debate, I
I
could
do.
probably ask Dr. Egel German because he's a Jewish Christian, like he specializes in Jewish. He's kind of like Dr. Michael Brown. I think he was actually a student and stuff. So if you want, and assuming he agrees, maybe sometime in April I could set that up because I know I've got another show with lined up for you in March. So
Let me think about it, because that's almost a different topic. I mean, almost. And I have to be perfectly frank. I'm not a fan of uh, the Jewish Christian thing, the Messianic Jewish uh,
oh,
thing.
but don't you think they'd be
Uh,
good at answering
I
that
think
question?
it's a muddy mixture of um, stuff. The Jews are not Christians. Okay, Judaism and Christianity are separate religions. Christians are not Jews. Christians don't think of themselves as Jews, and we have this ridiculous, almost undefinable term called Judeo-Christianity. That doesn't mean a thing. That just means that heavy syncretism happened, and so somewhere in history, you can find the link between the two, but they were always different branches, and they are exceptionally different branches today. And I think that Messianic Jews are just confused. Uh, so I would rather talk to a Jew who's actually a Jew, uh, as
Good
opposed
luck.
to a Jew who doesn't
Good
know
luck.
what the heck they.
Yeah. Well, actually, you would probably do well because Rabbi Twisinger loves atheists and stuff. But if he knows that you're going to go on with someone who can challenge you from a Christian standpoint. I've had a couple people, including a girl named Courtney, who knows Rabbi Tobias Singer personally, and he just refuses to debate anyone like Michael Brown or anyone who can challenge him and stuff like that. But yeah, he actually would go on, like he's been going on atheist shows and Muslim shows, anyone who kind of is against Christians. So okay, yeah, that could be.
I would talk to him. I don't need anyone to hate Christianity. I need a Jew who's a Jew. Um, you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
wanna, I don't want a Christian Muslim. That's right. What is
Christian.
that? What does that even mean?
Okay, fair enough. Okay, well, yeah, I tell you what though, I'm interested. I might do like a debate review. I might invite Yigal German on just my show and have him review our debate and see what he thinks and stuff.
I mean, we could do a round table. We could do just a conversation. It doesn't even have to be a moderated thing because I am interested. Um, I've gone as far as I can down the academic road, and without learning Hebrew, I don't think I can go any further. So, you know, I like to uh, listen to people who have that extra bit and can go further. Um,
Yeah, he knows
and
that.
unless you're hiding some qualifications, I don't think you speak Hebrew either. Um, so, you know, if we can talk to some people and just it doesn't need to be a debate. If we can just talk to some people who are very knowledgeable about the era and who might have interesting opinions that are different from ours here. That I mean, when I talked to Mike Lacona and Sean McDowell, I didn't debate them.
Hmm,
Uh, I was happy to grant them their expertise
sure.
and challenge where it seemed to to be needed, but I accept the expertise of experts.
Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah,
I think this is where kind of where we are. We need to find some experts.
yeah, fair enough. Yeah, well, let me reach out to him and see if he's interested. And like I said, it'll probably be a while, just because I've got so many shows. February's already fully booked, but maybe later in March or early April we can set that up if he
Yeah. All right. Well, looking forward to it. And skeptics and seekers.squarespace.com. Log in to discuss camp, discuss ways. Send me an email, skeptics and seekers at gmail.com. Where can people find you, Dale?
Real Seekers with an S on YouTube, or my blog is Real Seeker singular ministries.wordpress.com.
Okay. And until next time, I'll see you in the comments. In the meantime, I'm out.
All right, take care.
And